Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. Putin versus NATO. Putin helps the revolutionary Sahel states stand up straight to Trump and France. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe. Support the platform, y'all. A revolution is a way of life, and revolution is for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I got some revolutionary breakfast / brunch / lunch for y'all. Putin steps on Trump and NATO in Africa. Let's get into the content. Salute.
Vladimir Putin is moving deeper into the Sahel, this time not with troops or mercenaries, but through how the Sahel states communicate and defend their borders. For the first time ever, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are planning a shared communications satellite, one designed to operate outside Western control, and Russia says it is ready to build it. Burkina Faso's prime minister held talks with Russia's ambassador on launching a Russian-built telecommunications satellite. Reports say the project would serve the alliance of Sahel states, linking Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger through a single shared platform. Officials say this would not be a national satellite, but rather a shared asset, owned and used collectively by the Alliance for the AES. Analysts say this is a strategic upgrade, as the gains go far beyond technology. It would expand broadband and mobile connectivity in remote areas, where infrastructure is nearly non-existent. It would enable secure, encrypted communications for governments and armed forces. And through remote sensing, it would support border monitoring, surveillance, and disaster response in areas where ground infrastructure barely exists. This is not a sudden move, as it builds on years of quiet coordination between the Sahel states and the Kremlin. In September 2024, ministers from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso reportedly met officials from Russia's space agency, Roscosmos, in Bamako. Those talks focused on joint telecommunications and surveillance satellites designed to support security operations and civilian infrastructure. The stated goal was clear: reduce dependency on Western systems and tighten control over regional security. The satellite push comes as the alliance is rebuilding its entire security architecture. In December 2025, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger launched the AES, a 5,000-strong joint military force with headquarters based in Niamey, the capital of Niger. The force is commanded by Burkina General Daouda Traoré. Its mandate includes joint air operations, intelligence sharing, and cross-border offensives against terrorist groups, an issue the region has repeatedly been persistently dealing with. According to the United Nations, the Sahel now accounts for half of all global terrorism deaths. However, regional leaders blame the crisis on years of foreign intervention.
Some detractors hope to see Mali collapse. They wanted to see the Malian people on their knees, divided and weakened. Today, those on the side of the terrorist groups operating in our region are the French junta and the Algerian junta.
Well, analysts say a dedicated satellite would give the Sahel states a sharper eye on threats, faster response times against terrorist groups, and Moscow has been open about where it stands.
Terrorist threats and high activity of illegal armed groups remain present in the countries of the Alliance of Sahel states. We support your position on the necessity of strengthening the security, the defense of territories, and the sovereignty. The Russian Defense Ministry is ready to provide all-round assistance for ensuring stability in the region.
And Russia was also the first country to formally recognize the Alliance of Sahel states. Analysts say this deepening partnership comes as Western influence in the region continues to collapse. French forces have withdrawn from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The United States has imposed visa restrictions on all three, met with reciprocal bans. Niger has stripped France's Orano of its uranium mining rights, shifting preference towards Russian firms. All three AES states have also withdrawn from the International Criminal Court, calling it a biased Western institution. If the satellite deal moves forward, It will mark another decisive step by Sahel states to cut dependence on the West. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, analysts say the goal is clear: control their own eyes, ears, and signals in space. And as Western influence fades, Russia has emerged as their partner of choice.
The world happened this January that barely got any attention in the mainstream media. 3 countries in Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, they sat down with Russia and they made a deal. But here is the thing. This deal isn't about soldiers and it's not for weapons to fight insurgency. It was for something that could end up being more powerful than either of those. I'm talking about a satellite, their own satellite, one they control, one that operates completely outside Western infrastructure. And what is actually shocking here is that this didn't come out of nowhere, because the Alliance of Sahel States have been quite busy in the last couple of years. Like in just about a year, they have already launched a joint military force and created their own television network. They have already chased France out of their region and stopped them from taking their uranium. And then they signed partnerships with Russia for nuclear power plants, surveillance systems, and now space technology. Now, when you look at this, this is not just infrastructure we are looking at right here. This is a geopolitical realignment currently happening in real time, and it is raising a very important question. And frankly, the kind of question the West doesn't want any of us to ask. What if 60 years, 6 decades of Western partnership in Africa have failed so badly that African countries are now choosing a completely different path? So in this episode, I am going to try my best to show you what is actually being built, why it matters, and what it means for the future of Africa. So back to the main story. This January, in a quiet diplomatic meeting in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's prime minister sat down across the table from Russia's ambassador. And there is also a Russian astronaut in the room, someone who had just came back from about 6 months on the International Space Station. Now, the agenda of the meeting, it would change the geopolitics of Africa for a very long time to come. Because for the first time ever, for the first time in history, the Alliance of Sahel States is now planning to build one satellite that all of them can use together. Now, this particular satellite that I am talking about is different from anything that has come before it, especially in Africa. It will be the first shared telecommunications satellite owned and controlled by the Alliance of Sahel States. And Russia's space agency, Roscosmos, is the one leading the construction of this project. The timeline is pretty aggressive. The launch date is expected anywhere between 2 to 3 years. But the technical specifications of this project, that is what really matters here, because this satellite is going to do 4 things that Western countries, Western powers have never really allowed any country in Africa or the Sahel to do on their own. First, it will provide encrypted communications that only AES government can access. It means no surveillance from Western countries, no surveillance from France, and there will be no threat of shutdown with their usual sanctions. Secondly, it will offer broadband and mobile connectivity to remote areas where internet connectivity is basically lacking. And third, it will monitor borders using remote sensing technology. And finally, it will give the Alliance of Sahel State military forces real-time data sharing across the entire 3 countries of the Alliance of Sahel State. Now, for the first time in African history, the Sahel is going to control their own eyes, ears, and signals in the sky. And this is not the first time Russia is giving the AES access to the kind of technology that the West have been hiding away from Africa. Let me take you back to October 2024. Russia's State Atomic Energy Corporation, Rosatom, they signed a memorandum of understanding with Burkina Faso to build a nuclear power facility. Now, that was for Burkina Faso. Now, again, in July of 2025, a similar deal was signed with Niger, planning for 2 reactors that would each produce about 1 gigawatt of power. Now, in March of 2025, Mali signed their own preliminary agreement for nuclear infrastructure. And in September last year, an East African country followed the same path. I'm talking about Ethiopia. They announced a partnership for well over 2,000 megawatts of nuclear capacity, with Russia financing roughly 90% of the entire project. What Western institutions withheld from Africa for over 6 decades, nuclear technology, infrastructure, financing, and energy independence, Russia is now offering it to African countries. And this is all happening very fast. Now, right now, when you look at electricity supply across the AES countries, it is somewhere between 15 and 40% of the population, depending on your source or where you're looking at. And this isn't even a kind of luxury problem. Without electricity, there is no industrial development. And without industrial development, there is no job creation. And without jobs, there's only migration to Europe and poverty at home, and enough jobless people to join the insurgency that is causing chaos all across West Africa. Now, a lot of critics of nuclear power in Africa are saying that we should all go for renewable energy, that it is safer and it is something that Africa, in fact, they are saying they cannot trust Africa with nuclear power plants. They are talking about renewable energy, and it all sounds good on paper. But renewable energy requires expensive battery storage. It also requires grid stability technology that African countries can't currently afford. Nuclear power, nuclear technology is a different ball game. It provides stable electricity. They call it baseload power, like 24 hours a day. And it can power factories, data centers, hospitals, schools without any interruption. This is what Russia is now offering African countries. Rosatom, the Russian nuclear giant, they will finance somewhere between 80 and 90% of the project cost at around 3% interest. This isn't charity. Russia is not doing Father Christmas for Africa. It is actually a business. Russia gets access to uranium resources and long-term energy contracts, but it's fundamentally different from the kind of Western financing we are used to. Western firms, when you compare what they are doing in Africa, they want profit. They want profit and they want it fast. They are capitalists to the core. They also block technology transfer and they install equipment and they leave. Africa becomes dependent on foreign expertise. Russia's model is different. Rosatom is offering full technology transfer as part of this deal. It means that there will be workforce training programs, research facilities, financing with grace periods, and manageable repayment schedules. Now, consider some example, because this project is not only happening in the Alliance of Sahel States. A lot of African countries are actually signing up. Let me take you to Egypt. Egypt's El Daba nuclear project. It will have 4 reactors and it will cost $25 billion and about 70% Russian financed at 3% interest over more than 20 years. Now, for this Egyptian project, the construction is already going on. There is also the one happening in Bangladesh, Bangladesh's Rupa project. It is roughly 90% Russian financed with a 10-year grace period and 20-year repayment. Ethiopia in East Africa, they are targeting over 2,000 megawatts, essentially 100% Russian financed, and construction is scheduled to begin any minute. In fact, it was rumored to begin October last year. Now, this is not some empty white elephant project. This is actually real infrastructure being built all across Africa, while the West is still debating whether to help Africa with aid or not. After more than 6 decades of waiting for Western technology transfer in Africa, Russia is offering it in a little bit like in a very short period of time, ever since Russia started deepening their footprint on the African continent. But nuclear power isn't just about electricity. It's about transforming an entire region, like making Africa an industrial powerhouse that no longer depends on exporting raw materials to Western countries. Now, if the Sahel completes this nuclear project, and given Russian financing and commitment, it likely will. We are looking at somewhere around 2030 and 2035. The whole Sahel will have around 8,000 megawatts of clean, reliable electricity. And that's more power than all of sub-Saharan Africa has today from renewable energy sources, all combined. So what happens next? It will be industrialization. It will be manufacturing boom, and it will be a lot of job creation, a complete reversal of the colonial economy that Africa inherited. For more than 4 centuries, for 400 years, this model has been the same. It has not changed. It basically, in fact, it's all about extract raw materials, ship them to Europe or Asia, and then they bring it to Africa, and we pay like 10 times over for the finished product, essentially at inflated prices. It means that wealth is leaving Africa, but the profits are going outside the continent. It means there will be high unemployment, and poverty will basically be spreading across Africa. This colonial extraction economy looks something like this. Let me listen to this, my analysis. It might not be perfect, but it is closer to the reality on ground. Check this out. Burkina Faso mines their gold at cost of, let's say, $5 per gram. And France, they buy it at world price. Let's call it $60 per gram. So Burkina Faso receives $60 per gram of gold, but the finished jewelry they make from this gold, they will be selling it for $1,000 in Paris. Now, France is basically capturing around $940 of the whole value. That difference, that's roughly $940 gap. That is the kind of wealth that is being drained from this single transaction. Now, with nuclear power and industrial capacity, this extraction model changes dramatically. Burkina Faso doesn't have to sell their raw gold. They can refine it. That processing will add value. And that $60 becomes closer to $900 per gram through local processing. Now, the difference from this processing will remain in Africa. And the same applies to everything else that you can think of. Electronics manufacturing, steel production with nuclear-powered refining, and battery manufacturing for global economic vehicle markets, including agricultural processing. These are the things that this nuclear power plants that Russia is bringing to the Sahel, These are the things it will make possible. And this will create what economists call employment multipliers. It will create direct jobs in nuclear plants. And there will be indirect jobs through supply chains, construction, logistics, services, even skill development and technical education. There will be regional wealth and government revenue will increase. This is the kind of real value that is being created in the Sahel right now because of the kind of deals they are signing with Russia. And right now, roughly 60% of Africa is under the age of 25 years. And that means there is a huge demographic dividend here. There is a lot of labor. There's a lot of human resource in Africa. And there is a lot of hunger for employment. Vietnam, they built their manufacturing based on labor advantage. Bangladesh is also building their manufacturing based on they have a lot of human resources. And that labor advantage is something that we are not exploiting. We are not using it in Africa. And that labor advantage is eroding as wages rise in those countries. Africa is next. What happens when labor becomes expensive in Vietnam? And what happens when labor becomes expensive in Bangladesh or the almighty China? It means that they will look towards Africa. And it means that the countries that are investing in their future right now, these are the countries that will be the first to benefit when that time comes. And this is not some distant future. It is happening, and it is going to come faster than anyone realizes. And as an African country right now, if you're not investing in energy, if you're not investing in upgrading your electricity, you are going to miss out when this industrial revolution begins in Africa. But before any of this future happens, the Sahel has to solve an immediate problem. The problem is, how do you secure borders, monitor terrorism, and communicate across vast distances where there is barely any infrastructure? That is where the satellite that Russia is about to build comes in. And it does far more than just bring internet to remote villages. So the satellite that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are building with Russia is going to do 4 critical things that Western satellites can't, or should I say won't, do for Africa. This satellite will provide encrypted communications that only AES governments can access. It means constant monitoring of a vast swath of land. The 3 countries of AES, they're actually a very large swath of land. When they left ECOWAS, they left with more than 50% of the landmass. And these satellites will provide real-time data sharing between all the militaries in the AES. It will come with complete independence from Western infrastructure. The satellite monitoring changes everything when you look at it. Real-time Earth observation shows, it will show vehicle movement. It will also detect convoys and identify insurgent training camps, monitor border crossings. It will also track cross-border insurgency movement. It will provide targeting data for military responses. Now, the commander of the joint military force that AES already have, headquartered in Niger, will have access to this data. He can coordinate operations across all 3 nations simultaneously via encrypted communications. Means that intelligence sharing that can't be tapped or shut down by external Western powers that like sanctioning when things don't go the way they like in Africa. Western satellites from major US telecommunications providers, they are basically controlled by American corporations. Ground stations in the regions are limited and controlled by Western providers. The data can be shared with Western intelligence agencies, and these Western-controlled satellites could theoretically be shut down as sanction or some kind of punishment if they ask you to, for example, receive their third country deportees and you refuse. They can use it as a leverage and force you. This is basically how they control Africa. The Alliance of Sahel States satellite, this satellite that Russia is building, is different. It's going to be different from this kind of arrangement with Western powers because it will be owned by the AES government, controlled by the AES. There will be ground station built in the region, and the data, they will belong to the AES. It cannot be externally shut down. And beyond military applications, this satellite will enable disaster responses, agricultural monitoring, water availability tracking, even climate prediction. Now, in a region where climate change creates displacement and conflict, this satellite becomes a kind of critical infrastructure. It's not a luxury infrastructure. It's actually very important and critical. So the satellite does what Western institutions promised but never delivered after over 6 decades of their partnership with Africa. The Sahel, they can now defend themselves. They can now communicate securely and monitor their own territory. But the real significance, it goes beyond technology. This is actually a geopolitical statement because for the first time, the Sahel will be controlling their own eyes, ears, and signals in the space. Now, this is a welcome development in Africa because when you look at it, how the West deals with African countries, they hoard their technology. Yes, they use selling their military equipment to African countries as leverage. Yes, when they want something from you, even if you have paid for this military equipment, they can seize it and use it as a leverage to make you do something. It could be giving them some mining rights. It could be giving them oil wells if you are an oil producing country in Africa. It could be basically telling you, they will basically use you as a proxy to counter China and Russia in Africa. So these are the kind of conditions that come when Western countries have this type of deal that Russia is basically having with a lot of African countries right now. It's not just the AES. From the Sahel to North Africa to East Africa, Russia is everywhere giving this technology to any country in Africa that is ready to embrace it. The question is, when this industrial revolution that is impending, it is not a prediction. This is not a prediction. It will happen. Africa is ripe for this industrial revolution. And when that revolution begins, where do you think it will begin from? It will begin from the countries that are getting set, that are getting ready right now. It will begin from the countries that are investing in their energy infrastructure, countries that are investing in nuclear powers, countries that are maximizing renewable energies. Yes, these are the countries that will be on the front line of when this industrial boom manufacturing begins in Africa. You would think that a country as big as Nigeria, a country that sees itself as the giant of Africa, will be in the front of this type of opportunity to actually own a functional nuclear power plant. You would think they will be in the front of it, but they are not. Guess the countries that are taking the lead. It is the Alliance of Sahel States. It is Ethiopia. It is Egypt. It is Kenya. These are the countries that are currently leading the charge for nuclear power in Africa. And with the Sahel now having their own satellites to monitor, to have their own eyes and their own ears in the sky, it means total sovereignty. It means that intelligence leak will no longer be a problem, because when you use Western satellites, there is no way your intelligence will be secured from them. Their intelligence agencies basically have their their claws, held tightly in everything happening in your country. The AES knows that the world is changing. Yes, we are now in a multipolar world. It means that the destiny of your country, the future of your country will no longer be tied to Western control. You now have the opportunity to get this technology that the West will never trust Africa with. Russia is giving it to Africa. And it is a good development. See that the AES is taking advantage of this opportunity. And I hope that my own country, Nigeria, will make this move and actually solve the electricity problems we are having in the country, which will also position Nigeria to benefit when this manufacturing boom begins in Africa. And it is only the countries that are ready. Those are the countries that will be in the front of the line when that time comes, because manufacturing will be expensive in China very soon. It will be very expensive in Vietnam, and it will be very expensive in India and Bangladesh. And guess where they will come? They will come to Africa. And those that are ready, they will be the ones to benefit from it. Tell me what you
The arrest has been made. The conspirator is in custody. And yet, the crisis is only deepening. Paul-Henri Damiba, the former military leader accused of orchestrating a plot to assassinate Burkina Faso's current head of state and dismantle the country's security apparatus, now sits behind bars in Ouagadougou. But France has not backed down. Instead, Paris has doubled down, issuing what sources describe as direct military threats against Burkina Faso over developments tied to neighboring Togo. In response, Russia has entered the fray with a sharp retaliatory warning, framing any French intervention as an attack on Sahel sovereignty itself. What began as a domestic security operation has exploded into a geopolitical standoff that could reshape the entire region. This is no longer just about one man or one alleged coup. This is about who controls the future of the Sahel, and whether Africa's most volatile region will break free from decades of external influence or be pulled back into the orbit of its former colonial master. Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power in Burkina Faso in September 2022, the second military takeover in less than a year. His rise was fueled by public anger over the government's failure to contain a brutal jihadist insurgency that has killed thousands and displaced millions across the Sahel. Traoré positioned himself as a young, defiant leader determined to break with the past, willing to challenge both the terror groups ravaging his country and the foreign powers he accused of enabling the crisis. Among those powers, France loomed largest. For decades, Paris maintained a military presence across its former colonies in West Africa, justified under the banner of counterterrorism. But by the time Traoré seized power, that presence had become politically toxic. Mali had already expelled French forces. Niger would follow, and Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, demanded Paris withdraw entirely. France complied reluctantly, but the relationship never recovered. Paul-Henri Damiba was Traoré's predecessor. He had led the first coup in January 2022, overthrowing the elected government of Roch-Marc Christian Cabore, citing the same failures on security that would later be used to justify his own removal. But Damiba's time in power was brief and turbulent. He maintained ties with France, resisted the wave of anti-French sentiment sweeping the region, and ultimately failed to deliver the security gains he had promised. When Traoré ousted him in September, Damiba fled the country, eventually finding refuge in Togo. There, he remained, a political exile in a nation with close historical and diplomatic ties to France. For months, his presence was a quiet irritant. But according to Burkina Faso's government, Damiba was doing far more than lying low. He was planning a return, not through politics, but through violence. Burkina Faso alleges that Damiba masterminded a coordinated assassination plot targeting not just Traoré, but 19 senior security officials. The objective, according to Ouagadougou, was not merely to kill the leadership, but to decapitate the state. The plan, as described, was surgical and devastating. Eliminate the president and the core of the military command structure in one operation, triggering chaos, paralysis, and collapse. In the vacuum, jihadist forces would surge, governance would disintegrate, and Burkina Faso would descend into the kind of fragmented nightmare that has consumed parts of Somalia, Libya, and the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And in that wreckage, according to Traoré's allies, foreign interests would reassert control. Whether through a puppet regime, renewed military agreements, or direct intervention, the endgame was the same. Burkina Faso would lose its sovereignty. The arrest of Damiba was framed by Ouagadougou as a national security triumph. But it immediately triggered a diplomatic crisis. France, which has maintained close relations with Togo, responded not with silence, but with pressure. Reports emerged that Paris had issued direct warnings to Burkina Faso, framing the detention of Damiba and any potential trial as destabilizing to the region. The official line from France invoked old defense agreements and regional stability, painting Burkina Faso's actions as a threat to Togo's sovereignty. But the subtext was unmistakable. Damiba, whether guilty or not, was under French protection, and Traoré had crossed a line by moving against him. Then came the threats. Multiple sources indicate that France, either directly or through intermediaries, communicated the possibility of military consequences if Burkina Faso proceeded with its case against Damiba. The exact nature of those threats remains unclear. Were they warnings of targeted strikes, economic pressure, covert destabilization? Whatever the specifics, the message was received in Ouagadougou as an ultimatum, and it was met not with capitulation, but with defiance. Because Burkina Faso was no longer alone, Russia entered the crisis with a public statement that was as blunt as it was consequential. Moscow openly rejected France's framing, asserting that Burkina Faso has a legitimate right to defend its national security and hold coup plotters accountable. Russian officials went further, warning that French military pressure and strike threats risk igniting a wider regional conflict. Most significantly, Russia declared that any foreign intervention would be seen as an attack on Sahel sovereignty itself. This was not diplomatic hedging. This was a red line drawn in public and aimed directly at Paris. That Russia's involvement in the Sahel is not new, but it has accelerated dramatically in recent years. As France's influence has waned, Moscow has stepped in, offering military support, trainers, and private security contractors to governments that have broken with the West. In Mali, Russian forces and Wagner Group operatives have filled the void left by departing French troops. In Burkina Faso, the relationship has grown quietly but steadily, with reports of Russian advisors and equipment flowing into the country. Traoré has not publicly acknowledged the full extent of this cooperation, but the symbolism is clear. Where France once held sway, Russia is now a counterweight. And in this crisis, Moscow has chosen to make that support explicit. What makes this moment so dangerous is not just the clash of interests, but the clash of narratives. France insists it is defending regional stability and the sovereignty of Togo, a nation that did not ask for Damiba's extradition and has not publicly accused Burkina Faso of violating its borders. Paris frames its position as principled, rooted in international law and mutual defense obligations. But to Ouagadougou, and increasingly to much of the Sahel, this is a transparently self-serving fiction. France is not defending Togo. It is defending a man it sees as preferable to Traoré. A man who, whether by design or circumstance, represents a version of Burkina Faso more aligned with French interests. And by threatening military action, Paris is signaling that it will not tolerate a Sahel that operates outside its influence. Russia, meanwhile, is framing this as a fight for African sovereignty. Moscow's rhetoric emphasizes self-determination, the rejection of neo-colonialism, and the right of nations to choose their own partners. It is a narrative that resonates deeply across a region that has spent decades watching foreign powers intervene, extract resources, and depart without delivering security or prosperity. Whether Russia's intentions are genuinely anti-colonial or simply opportunistic is almost beside the point. What matters is that Moscow is offering something France no longer can: unconditional support for regimes willing to defy the West. And in a region where legitimacy increasingly flows from resistance rather than alignment, that support is politically invaluable. The crisis has also exposed the limits of regional diplomacy. The Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, has historically been the primary mechanism for managing political transitions and security crises in the region. But ECOWAS itself is fracturing. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, all governed by military juntas that seized power in recent years, have formed a mutual defense pact and have threatened to withdraw from the bloc entirely. They accuse ECOWAS of being a tool of French influence, citing the organization's harsh sanctions against their governments and its reluctance to condemn French military presence. Togo, by contrast, remains a member in good standing, aligned with the bloc's more pro-Western leadership. This split has turned what might once have been a regional dispute into a proxy battle between competing visions of West African order. And then there is the extradition question, which France has tried to center, but which Burkina Faso insists is irrelevant. Togo has not formally requested Damiba's return. There is no legal process underway demanding his release. What exists instead is French pressure, diplomatic and possibly military, aimed at forcing Ouagadougou to reverse course. This suggests that the core issue is no longer legal or procedural. It is political. France does not want Damiba tried in Burkina Faso because a trial would be public, detailed, and potentially explosive. If the allegations are proven, or even if they are simply aired in open court, the revelations could implicate foreign actors. They could expose networks of influence, funding, and coordination that extend far beyond one man. They could turn Damiba from a failed coup leader into a symbol of foreign interference. And that is a risk Paris cannot afford. Traoré, for his part, has been cast by his supporters as a symbol of resistance. At just 34 years old when he took power, he represents a generational shift, a break from the old guard that governed through compromise with external powers. His rhetoric is uncompromising. He speaks of sovereignty, dignity, and the need to fight both terrorism and imperialism. He has accused France of supporting jihadist groups to justify its military presence, a claim that Paris vehemently denies, but which enjoys widespread belief across the Sahel. Whether or not Traoré can deliver on his promises is uncertain. Burkina Faso remains deeply insecure, with large swaths of territory outside government control. The economy is fragile. The population is exhausted. But politically, Traoré has tapped into something powerful, the sense that the old system has failed, and that only a complete break with the past can offer a path forward. Russia's backing has amplified that narrative. Moscow's statement in defense of Burkina Faso was not a favor. It was a strategic move. By positioning itself as the defender of Sahel sovereignty, Russia gains influence, credibility, and leverage. It signals to other governments in the region that alignment with Moscow offers protection from Western pressure. It deepens the wedge between France and its former colonies. And it reinforces the broader global confrontation between Western-led order and the so-called multipolar world that Russia and China have championed. In this framing, Burkina Faso is not just a country dealing with an assassination plot. It is a battleground in a much larger struggle. France, for all its military and diplomatic resources, is finding itself on the defensive. The days when Paris could intervene in West Africa with impunity are over. Public opinion across the Sahel is overwhelmingly hostile to French presence. Governments that once relied on French support are now seeking alternatives. And the justification that sustained decades of intervention, the fight against terrorism, has lost credibility. The terror threat has not diminished under French leadership. If anything, it has spread. From northern Mali to Burkina Faso to northern Nigeria, jihadist violence has expanded in scope and lethality. The narrative that France is a stabilizing force has collapsed under the weight of its own failures. But France is not retreating quietly. The reported threats against Burkina Faso suggest that Paris is willing to escalate rather than accept irrelevance. Whether that escalation takes the form of airstrikes, covert operations, or proxy support for armed groups remains to be seen. But the logic is clear. If Traoré succeeds, if he consolidates power, holds Damiba accountable, and strengthens ties with Russia, he becomes a model. Other governments will follow. The Sahel will drift further from French influence. and Paris, already diminished, will lose what remains of its strategic foothold in a region it has dominated for more than a century. This is where the stakes become clear. A military confrontation between France and Burkina Faso, even a limited one, would not remain contained. Russia has made clear it would view such action as an attack on sovereignty. Other nations in the region, particularly Mali and Niger, have mutual defense agreements with Burkina Faso. ECOWAS would be forced to choose sides, likely fracturing further. And the jihadist groups operating across the Sahel would exploit the chaos, launching attacks, seizing territory, and positioning themselves as the ultimate winners of a conflict between foreign powers and fragile states. The continued aggressive posture from Paris, even after Damiba's arrest, reveals that this was never really about one man. Damiba is a symbol. He represents a version of Burkina Faso that France could tolerate, even if it could not control. His removal, his arrest, and the possibility of his trial represent the final severance of a relationship that has defined West African geopolitics for generations. France is not threatening Burkina Faso because it fears for Togo's sovereignty. It is threatening Burkina Faso because it fears losing the Sahel entirely. Russia, meanwhile, is exploiting that fear with precision. Moscow's support for Traoré is not altruistic. It is transactional. Russia gains access to resources, influence over governance, and a foothold in a region that borders the Mediterranean and links West Africa to the broader struggle for influence across the continent. If France escalates, Russia wins. If France backs down, Russia also wins. The only losing scenario for Moscow is one in which the Sahel stabilizes under Western influence. And that scenario is vanishing by the day. For Burkina Faso, the path forward is treacherous. Traoré has staked his legitimacy on sovereignty and security. But sovereignty without stability is hollow. The country remains under siege from jihadist forces. The economy is struggling, and the population, while supportive of Traoré's defiance, is desperate for tangible improvements in safety and living conditions. If Traoré cannot deliver, the narrative of resistance will lose its power. And the same forces that brought him to power could just as easily turn against him. But for now, he holds the advantage. Damiba is in custody. France's threats have been met with Russian support, and the broader Sahel is watching. If Burkina Faso weathers this storm, if Traoré survives and strengthens his position, the message will resonate across the region. Defiance is possible. Alignment with the West is optional. And sovereignty, however fragile, can be defended. What happens next could redefine the region. Will France escalate, risking a confrontation that could spiral beyond its control? Will Russia deepen its involvement, turning the Sahel into another theater of great power competition? Will Traoré consolidate or collapse under the weight of internal and external pressure? And will the people of Burkina Faso, caught between terror, coups, and geopolitical maneuvering, finally see the security and stability they have been promised for decades? The arrest of Paul-Henri Damiba was supposed to be the end of the crisis. Instead, it has revealed how deep the fractures run, not just within Burkina Faso, but across the Sahel, between Africa and its former colonizers, and within the global order itself. This is no longer a story about one alleged plot or one defiant leader. This is a story about power, sovereignty, and the question of who gets to decide the future of a region that has been shaped by foreign intervention for far too long. The answer to that question will determine not just what happens in Burkina Faso, but what kind of Africa emerges in the decades to come.
Africa. In what can only be described as a seismic geopolitical shift, China has just armed Burkina Faso to the teeth with some of the most sophisticated modern weapons on the planet. The world is stunned. Global powers are watching in disbelief. And Africa is witnessing history unfold right before its eyes. For decades, African nations have been left vulnerable, under-equipped, and dependent on so-called allies who promised support but delivered nothing but conditions, debts, and exploitation. But today, something has changed. Burkina Faso, a country that has stood firm against terrorism, foreign manipulation, and external control, has just received hundreds of advanced Chinese military systems. We're talking over 400 VN-22B armored vehicles, BLL-05 gun mortars, and SR-5 rocket systems capable of precision strikes. This is not just about weapons. This is about sovereignty. This is about the rebirth of African military power. Stay tuned, because what you're about to hear will shake your understanding of Africa's future and global politics. This is the news the mainstream doesn't want you to hear. The announcement came like a thunderclap. Reports confirm that China has delivered a massive shipment of military hardware to Burkina Faso. And let's be clear, this isn't symbolic aid. This is a full-scale arming of a sovereign African nation determined to protect itself. The star of the delivery, the VN-22B armored vehicle. Sleek, heavily fortified, and designed for modern combat. Burkina Faso has reportedly received over 400 of them. These vehicles will transform the country's mobility, giving its armed forces the power to maneuver swiftly across the battlefield. But that's just the beginning. China also provided the BL-05 gun mortar system, a weapon that combines the range of artillery with the precision of mortars. With this, Burkina Faso can strike terrorist hideouts with pinpoint accuracy. And then the game changer, the SR-5 rocket system. This isn't just any rocket launcher. This is a multi-caliber, highly mobile, precision-guided strike weapon. With it, Burkina Faso gains the ability to neutralize large-scale threats before they even get close. This is what true partnership looks like. Not empty promises, not aid wrapped in chains of exploitation, but real, concrete support. For years, Burkina Faso has been a frontline state in the war against terrorism. Militants backed by foreign interests have terrorized communities, destroyed villages, and killed thousands. But despite this, the country often fought with outdated weapons, limited supplies, and little international backing. But now, the balance of power is shifting. With the VN-22B armored fleet, Burkina Faso can defend its cities and villages with strength. With the BLL-05 gun mortars, they can eliminate enemy camps without sacrificing precision. And with the SR-5 rocket system, they can dismantle terrorist networks before they strike. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso is no longer just defending itself. It is taking control of the battlefield. Let's be honest, this isn't just about Burkina Faso. This is about China making a bold statement to the world. For decades, Africa has been armed and exploited by the West. Weapons came at a price: resources, political influence, and sovereignty. But China has stepped in with something radically different. By supplying Burkina Faso with these advanced systems, Beijing is sending a message loud and clear. Africa, you are not alone. This is a direct challenge to Western dominance on the continent. While Western powers talk of democracy and partnerships, but maintain military bases and exploit mineral wealth, China is giving Africa the tools to stand on its own 2 feet. The big question now is this: will Africa finally wake up? Because while Burkina Faso is arming itself with Chinese support, the truth is Africa cannot depend on imports forever. Real independence will come when Africa begins producing its own weapons, its own tanks, its own rocket systems. And Burkina Faso's step today may just be the spark. Imagine if Africa pooled its resources, its engineers, its factories, and created its own military-industrial complex. The continent would no longer beg for support. It would become its own shield and sword. China's delivery is more than a gift. It's a challenge. a challenge for Africa to rise, to unite, and to protect itself once and for all. Unsurprisingly, the West has been silent on this. Why? Because this delivery is a direct blow to their influence in Africa. For years, Western nations used weapons as leverage. They gave just enough to keep African armies dependent, but never enough to make them independent. That era is ending. Burkina Faso's new arsenal is proof that Africa can have strong allies outside of the traditional Western sphere. And that terrifies those who have long profited from Africa's weakness. Behind closed doors, there is panic, because the day Africa stops depending on foreign bases and controlled aid is the day Africa becomes unstoppable. What happens now? Burkina Faso is positioned to become a regional military power. With its new equipment, the country can not only protect its borders, but also support neighbors in the fight against terrorism. This could mark the beginning of a new West African military alliance, one where nations no longer wait for foreign intervention, but instead handle security their own way. And let's not forget, this isn't happening in isolation. Across Africa, there's a growing movement of nations kicking out foreign troops, reclaiming their resources, and charting independent paths. Burkina Faso is at the forefront of this revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing right now is the dawn of a new era. Burkina Faso, once written off as a weak, struggling state, has just been transformed into a formidable force thanks to a partnership with China that delivered real, tangible support. This is more than weapons. This is about dignity. This is about sovereignty. This is about Africa rising from the ashes of exploitation. For too long, African nations were told to wait, to depend, to compromise. But not anymore. Burkina Faso's new arsenal is proof that when Africa is backed with real partnership, it can stand tall, defend itself, and chart its own destiny. The West is nervous, the world is watching, and Africa is awakening. But here's the real question. Will this be the start of Africa's true independence in defense and security? Or will it be another moment in history lost to division and hesitation? The choice is Africa's. One thing is clear. The sound of SR-5 rocket systems, the power of VN-22B armored vehicles, and the precision of BL-5 gun mortars, now in the hands of Burkina Faso, send a message that cannot be ignored. Africa will no longer be a pawn. Africa will be a power. And as this news breaks, the world holds its breath. Because what just happened in Burkina Faso is not just a military delivery, it is the first shot in a new struggle for Africa's future.
In Africa, the story usually sounds familiar. Soldiers, weapons, gold, oil. But what if the most powerful move Russia is making on the continent has nothing to do with guns or minerals? What if the real strategy is something far quieter and far more permanent? Across Africa, a silent transformation is underway. Not on battlefields, but inside power ministries, energy agreements, and long-term contracts most people never read. Russia, through its state nuclear giant, is signing deals, training engineers, financing reactors, and embedding itself into the very systems that keep nations running. This isn't just about electricity. It's about who controls power for the next 50 years. From massive nuclear projects in North Africa to early-stage agreements in the Sahel and East Africa, Russia is offering African nations something they desperately need: reliable, round-the-clock energy. No blackouts, no fuel shortages, no waiting for rain or sunlight. But nuclear power comes with a cost that isn't measured in megawatts. Once a country commits, it doesn't commit for one election cycle. It commits for generations. fuel, technology, training, debt, regulation, all tied to one supplier for decades. So this video isn't really about reactors. It's about how Russia is quietly positioning itself at the center of Africa's energy future and what that means for sovereignty, development, and power in a world where electricity decides everything. In Egypt, Russia is already turning this strategy into concrete reality. At El Dabaa, Moscow is financing one of the largest nuclear power plants in Africa, a nearly $29 billion project with repayment terms that stretch far into the future. This is not short-term aid. It is a decades-long financial and energy commitment with deep consequences for Egypt's economy and independence. And while Western capitals debate, hesitate, and issue statements, Russia is acting. Deals are signed, engineers are trained, reactors are built, and influence is quietly planted deep beneath Africa's soil. So this video is not really about reactors or megawatts. It's about who controls Africa's energy tomorrow and what that control means for geopolitics, economic power, and long-term sovereignty in a rapidly changing world. To understand why Russia's nuclear strategy is gaining ground in Africa, we have to start with one simple truth. Africa does not have an ideology problem. Africa has an electricity problem. Across the continent, power shortages are not a crisis. They are routine. Blackouts are expected. Factories shut down not because demand is weak, but because the power cannot stay on long enough to keep machines running day and night. Hospitals rely on generators. Businesses budget for fuel before they budget for growth. Africa is home to more than 1.4 billion people, yet it produces less electricity than some single industrialized nations. Hydropower depends on rain. Solar depends on weather and storage. Gas depends on pipelines, security, and political stability. African governments understand this reality. That is why they are searching for one thing above all else: base load power, electricity that runs nonstop 24 hours a day in every season, under every condition. And this is where nuclear power enters the conversation. Nuclear energy provides massive, steady electricity for decades once built. One nuclear plant can power entire industrial zones, rail networks, and cities without interruption. Western countries know this too, but here is the difference. When African nations approached Western partners for nuclear cooperation, the response was slow, conditional, and expensive. Financing came with political strings. Environmental approvals dragged for years. Training programs were limited, and in some cases, African countries were told nuclear power was too advanced or too risky for them. Russia offered something else. Russia offered packages, not lectures. Through Rosatom, Russia does not just sell reactors. It offers full nuclear ecosystems from financing, construction, fuel supply, maintenance, and training of local engineers. It also provides scholarships for African students to study nuclear science in Russia and long-term technical support that can last 40 to 60 years. For countries desperate for reliable power, this is attractive. Russia presents nuclear energy not as a luxury, but as a development tool, a way to industrialize faster, a way to escape energy poverty, and a way to power factories instead of importing finished goods. This is why nations like Egypt, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Niger, Uganda, Rwanda, Ghana, and Burkina Faso have all signed nuclear cooperation agreements with Russia in different forms, not because they are choosing Russia over the West ideologically, but because they are choosing electricity over darkness. Now, Russia's nuclear strategy in Africa is not about quick wins, it is about time. Unlike oil, which can be sold today and forgotten tomorrow, nuclear power creates relationships that last 40 to 60 years, and Russia understands this better than anyone. When Rosatom signs a nuclear deal with an African country, it is not a simple construction contract. It is a long-term partnership that touches almost every part of the state. First comes financing. Most African countries cannot afford to build nuclear plants outright. The cost runs into tens of billions of dollars. Russia steps in with state-backed loans, often covering the majority of construction costs. Repayment stretches over decades, tied to future electricity revenues. This immediately creates dependence. If the plant must run to repay the loan, then the relationship cannot be easily broken. Next comes technology. Russian reactors use Russian designs, Russian fuel assemblies, Russian safety systems, and Russian software. Even if the plant is built on African soil, the technology remains Russian. Fuel rods must be supplied, spent fuel must be managed, and upgrades must be approved. This means the host country stays connected to Russia's nuclear supply chain for decades. Then comes human capital. African engineers, technicians, and regulators are trained in Russia. Scholarships are offered and nuclear institutes are linked directly to Russian universities and agencies. So, over time, a whole generation of energy experts grows up professionally aligned with Russian systems, standards, and networks. This is soft power, but it is deep and structural. And unlike military deals which can be canceled, nuclear cooperation becomes embedded in the national grid. You cannot switch off a nuclear plant like you cancel a weapons contract. That is why nuclear power is geopolitically powerful. It ties electricity, debt, skills, regulation, and national planning into one long relationship. For Russia, this creates influence that survives elections, leadership changes, and even diplomatic tensions. And for African governments, it offers something rare, a path to industrial power without waiting for Western approval. But this strategy also raises serious questions. Who controls the fuel? Who controls pricing? And most importantly, what happens if relations sour? But before we answer this, let's look at the countries where Russia has signed nuclear deals with. As we stated earlier, Russia's nuclear ambitions in Africa are not limited to one country. They stretch across the continent, from North Africa to the Sahel, and from the Horn to West Africa. Now, one of the most advanced and most expensive nuclear projects on the continent is taking shape in Egypt. At El Dabaa, Russia's state atomic company Rosatom is building a multi-unit nuclear power plant that could eventually provide a significant portion of Egypt's electricity. Construction of these reactors, each with modern pressurized water technology, began years ago and continues to move forward, with units expected online by the late 2020. The deal includes Russia financing the bulk of the cost and supplying nuclear fuel under long-term contracts. This project is not just important for Egypt, it is a flagship, a model of how Russia intends to anchor nuclear infrastructure in Africa. In Ethiopia, a country that has struggled for reliable electricity for decades, Russia and Ethiopia signed an agreement to establish the planning and construction of its first nuclear power station. The deal goes beyond a single contract. It includes technical planning, training of Ethiopian engineers, and building the institutional backbone for a nuclear sector. This is not a one-off project, but a roadmap for future cooperation to bring nuclear into the national grid. For a country with massive development needs, nuclear energy is seen as a breakthrough, but it also means deep Russian involvement over the long run. In Niger, Russia's strategy is slightly different but equally strategic. Niger is one of the world's major uranium producers, a key nuclear fuel. Recently, Niger and Russia signed a memorandum of understanding not just on peaceful nuclear cooperation, but also on uranium exploitation agreements. Russia wants access not just to build power plants, but to secure the raw material that fuels them. This transforms Niger from a potential reactor host to part of the supply chain for Russian nuclear fuel itself. Beyond these headline projects, Russia's footprint in nuclear cooperation spreads even further. At least 15 African countries have signed some form of nuclear cooperation agreement with Russia through Rosatom. From training programs to research centers, policy frameworks, and feasibility studies. Some of these agreements extend to nations as diverse as Algeria, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, Congo, Tanzania, Ghana, and South Africa, exploring training, infrastructure, or preliminary roadmaps. This network of agreements is not random. Each one is another tie, another decade-long connection that binds Russian nuclear technology, fuel, expertise, and regulatory standards to a growing number of African states. So what does this mean? Well, when you look at these cases together, a pattern emerges. Russia is not simply selling reactors one by one. It is embedding technology in national energy systems, training personnel who will build and run nuclear sectors, securing access to uranium and other materials, and laying regulatory and institutional foundations that keep decades of collaboration in place. This deep involvement means that even after a reactor is built, Russia's influence does not end. It continues through fuel supply, maintenance, training, and technical support. When we zoom out, these are not isolated deals. They are chapters in a single continent-wide strategy. Now, what does Russia's nuclear strategy mean for Africa as a whole? To understand why Russia's nuclear expansion in Africa matters, you have to look beyond electricity and power plants. This is not just an energy story. It is a geopolitical story. Nuclear power changes relationships between countries in a way few other technologies do. When a country builds a nuclear plant, it does not just buy equipment. It enters a relationship that can last 50 to 70 years. The fuel, the maintenance, the safety systems, the training, even the emergency protocols, all of them stay connected to the original supplier. This is where Russia's strategy becomes clear. When Rosatom builds a reactor in Africa, Russia is not just selling power, it is locking in influence for generations. For decades, Africa's energy systems have been shaped mainly by Western oil companies, Western banks, and Western institutions. Financing often came with conditions, and policy advice often came with pressure. Energy shortages were treated as technical problems, not political ones. Russia is offering something very different. It tells African governments, we will build the infrastructure, we will finance it, we will train your people, and we will not lecture you about your politics. For leaders who feel boxed in by Western demands or frustrated by slow development, that message is powerful. This is especially important in a world where sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial pressure are becoming common tools of global politics. Countries that rely entirely on Western systems feel exposed. Nuclear cooperation with Russia looks to some like a form of strategic insurance. While this is great, it's a fact that this shift also creates new dependencies. When nuclear fuel comes from Russia, when spare parts come from Russia, when engineers are trained using Russian systems, cutting ties becomes extremely difficult. Even if political relationships change, the infrastructure remains. That is why the West is watching these deals very closely. The United States and Europe have long dominated global nuclear standards, fuel markets, and safety frameworks. Russia's growing presence challenges that dominance. It gives Moscow long-term leverage in regions where it previously had limited economic influence. China understands this game too. That is why China is also expanding its nuclear diplomacy, often competing quietly with Russia for contracts and influence. Unfortunately, Africa is becoming a key arena in this competition. For African countries, this creates both opportunity and risk. The opportunity is clear. Nuclear power offers stable electricity, industrial growth, and reduced reliance on fossil fuels. It can support factories, rail systems, data centers, and entire modern economies. But the risk is strategic dependence. If nuclear policy is rushed, if agreements are poorly negotiated, or if transparency is weak, countries may trade short-term power gains for long-term loss of control. This is why Russia's nuclear push is not just about lights turning on. It is about who shapes Africa's energy future, who sets the rules, and who remains indispensable when everything else changes. And this brings us to the most important question of all. Is Africa choosing Russia because it offers the best technology or because it offers the least resistance? Well, at this point, one thing is clear. Russia's nuclear push into Africa is not accidental. It is not charity, and it is not just about electricity. It is a long-term play for relevance, influence, and strategic survival in a world where traditional power tools like oil and gas are slowly losing their dominance. For Africa, nuclear power arrives at a difficult moment. The continent is growing fast, cities are expanding, and industries need reliable energy. While solar and wind are promising, they are not always stable. Hydropower depends on rainfall, and fossil fuels are expensive and politically risky. Nuclear power looks like a shortcut to modernity. One plant can power millions of homes. One deal can unlock decades of electricity. One agreement can change a country's development path. But nuclear power is not just infrastructure, it is a system. Once a country commits, it commits for generations. Fuel cycles last decades, waste storage lasts centuries, and safety responsibilities never end. Besides this, the political relationship behind the reactor often outlives the government that signed the deal. This is where Africa must be careful. The real danger is not nuclear energy itself. Many countries use it successfully. The real danger is entering these agreements without full control, strong regulation, and clear long-term planning. If Africa does not build local expertise, nuclear power becomes permanent dependence. If contracts are opaque, costs quietly rise. If institutions are weak, safety risks grow. Worse, energy independence can quickly turn into energy capture. Russia understands this. That is why it offers full package solutions. Build, finance, fuel, maintain, and manage. It is convenient, but convenience has a price. question Africa must ask is simple. Who controls the switch? If Africa can use nuclear power as a bridge, building skills, strengthening institutions, diversifying partners, then nuclear energy can support real development. But if Africa treats nuclear deals as political shortcuts or symbolic wins, the continent risks replacing one form of dependency with another, because in the coming decades, power will not only decide who has light and factories, power will decide who negotiates from strength, who resists pressure, and who shapes their own destiny. Russia knows this. That is why it came with reactors instead of only soldiers. And Africa now faces a quiet but historic choice. Not whether to use nuclear power, but how, with whom, and on whose terms. If you want more deep, fact-based African geopolitical stories that explain the forces shaping the continent behind the scenes, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.
There was a time when its soldiers trained with wooden rifles, not as tradition, not as symbolism, but because real weapons were withheld. This wasn't poverty. Mali has gold. This was control. And for decades, France made sure Mali stayed weak. Then terrorism came, and Mali became the testing ground for hell. But yesterday something changed. New weapons, delivered directly to the Malian army, bought with Malian gold. No permission, no apologies. And the message is clear. Mali is done asking. Quick message before we continue. This channel is demonetized, shadow banned, and pressured because truth is expensive. If you want independent Pan-African media that answers to no government and no embassy, join the channel membership below. Members don't just support. They help decide what we investigate next. Now let's talk about how Mali went from wooden guns to steel resolve. Let me take you back, because you need to understand what Mali has been through. For years, decades, Malian soldiers trained with wooden rifles. Wooden. Not because the country couldn't afford real ones. Mali is one of Africa's top gold producers, but because France controlled Mali's security architecture, its military partnerships, its budgetary priorities, and most critically, its ability to arm itself. Even as Mali exported gold to the world, decisions about defense spending were constrained, delayed, quietly vetoed. The logic was always the same. You don't need strong weapons, you're not at war. Sound familiar? It's the same lie they told Burkina Faso, the same lie they told Niger. Keep them weak, keep them dependent, keep them controllable. And for years, Mali obeyed, because it had no choice. Then 2011 happened. Libya collapsed. NATO destroyed Gaddafi's government and walked away. And the weapons, the fighters, the chaos, they didn't disappear. They flooded south, into the Sahel, into Mali. Terrorist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS poured across the border. They moved fast. They moved organized. And Mali, with its wooden rifles and rationed ammunition, couldn't stop them. The north collapsed almost overnight. Entire regions fell outside state control. Timbuktu, Gao, Kidal, gone. And where was France? Oh, they showed up. Operation Serval, Operation Barkhane, thousands of French troops on Malian soil. But here's the thing, French operations were deployed, but Malian forces remained under-equipped, under-trained, structurally dependent. France managed the battlefield. Mali just bled on it. Decisions were outsourced, strategy was imposed. Mali became a testing ground for French counterterrorism doctrine. And while terrorism spread, Malian soldiers paid the price. They fought with courage, but without power. Wooden guns against AK-47s, rationed bullets against endless insurgents. This wasn't a war. This was a massacre in slow motion, and France called it partnership. By 2020, Mali had had enough. The people were done. The soldiers were done. And a man named Assimi Goïta was watching. Colonel Assimi Goïta wasn't a politician. He was a soldier, special forces. He'd seen the battlefield. He'd seen his brothers die with outdated weapons while French forces operated with air support, intelligence, and unlimited resources. He'd seen the lie, and in August 2020, he acted. Goïta led a military coup that removed President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta from power. The justification: security. The government had failed. Terrorism was spreading, soldiers were dying, and nothing was changing. But here's what makes Goïta different. He didn't just remove a president. He dismantled a system designed to keep Mali weak, a system where Mali's gold funded foreign banks while its soldiers held wooden guns, a system where France decided what Mali could buy, when it could act, and how much it could spend on its own defense. Goïta looked at that system and said, "No more. France is expelled. From Mali. Not politely, not gradually. Out." Military agreements terminated, bases closed. The French ambassador declared persona non grata. And for the first time in decades, Mali began to decide for itself what weapons it needed, how much to spend, when to act. And that's when the real arming began. Russia, Turkey, China, anyone willing to sell without strings attached. Drones, helicopters, armored vehicles, artillery, ammunition, training programs. Mali wasn't just buying weapons, it was reclaiming sovereignty. And the funding? Malian gold. Because here's what people don't understand. Mali was never poor. It was controlled. Its gold mines generated billions. But that wealth was locked in foreign financial systems, restricted by French oversight, funneled through agreements that prioritized everyone except Mali. Goïta broke those chains. He redirected Mali's gold revenues directly into defense. No permission, no approval, no excuses. And yesterday, we saw the results. New military equipment was delivered directly to the Malian army, not through intermediaries, not through UN oversight, not through French partnerships. State to army, direct, immediate, operational. This wasn't a parade. It wasn't propaganda. It was preparation. Because President Assimi Goïta understands exactly what President Ibrahim Traoré has been warning about. The Black Winter is coming. Let's talk about what the Black Winter actually means. Because this isn't some vague metaphor, it's a forecast. President Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso and president of the Alliance of Sahel States, warned that the Sahel is entering a phase of intensified destabilization. Worse than the Arab Spring of 2011. Worse than the chaos that destroyed Libya and flooded the region with weapons and fighters. The Black Winter includes intensified terrorist offensives, economic warfare and sanctions designed to strangle the AES, information attacks and disinformation campaigns to delegitimize the governments, attempts at regime destabilization, coups, assassinations, proxy conflicts, political isolation from Western-aligned blocs, all at once, all coordinated. And Mali is preparing for all of it. Because Mali has already lived through hell. It knows what happens when you're unprepared. It knows what happens when you depend on foreign powers to protect you. It knows what happens when your soldiers hold wooden guns. So Goïta is making sure that never happens again. Weapons deliveries are timed. Training cycles are accelerated. Logistics chains are reinforced. The Malian army isn't just growing. It's transforming. From a defensive force waiting for rescue to an offensive force ready to act. And it's not acting alone. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, 3 countries, 1 alliance. The Alliance of Sahel States, the AES. This isn't a symbolic bloc. It's a military and political alignment forged under fire, and it operates on one principle: prepare now or collapse later. When Burkina Faso recently revealed long-range missile systems, the world acted surprised. When Niger expelled French and American forces, the world called it reckless. When Mali started buying weapons with its own gold, the world stayed silent. Because they don't want to admit what's happening. The Sahel is walking away from dependency, from control, from the lie that African countries need foreign permission to defend themselves. The AES shares intelligence, coordinates borders, trains together, and arms together. What affects one affects all. Mali's weapons deliveries aren't just for Mali, they're for the entire bloc. Because the Black Winter won't target one country, it will target the movement, and the AES is making sure it's ready. President Goita's actions align perfectly with the doctrine articulated by AES President Ibrahim Traoré. Weapons are not aggression, they're insurance. Deterrence is not paranoia, it's survival. And sovereignty is not granted, it's taken. And here's the thing, the psychological shift is just as important as the weapons themselves. For years, Malian soldiers were told they weren't trusted with real equipment, that they didn't need it, that someone else would handle security. Now, they're being equipped, trained, trusted. An army that believes it is trusted fights differently. An army that is equipped fights longer. And an army that knows its government has its back. Unbreakable. Yesterday's weapons deliveries sent a message, not just to Mali, to everyone watching, to terrorist groups. Mali is no longer underarmed. The days of easy targets are over. To foreign powers, Mali is no longer constrained. Your approval is irrelevant. To the Malian people, your gold is working for you, finally. And to France, the era of control is finished. France spent decades managing Mali's security architecture, controlling its budgets, restricting its weapons purchases, ensuring Mali could never act independently. As long as Mali couldn't arm itself, it couldn't truly govern itself. Assimi Goïta shattered that system, not with speeches, with action. By reclaiming budgetary control and redirecting gold revenues, Mali dismantled a structure that had kept it strategically naked. The result is what we see now. Weapons arriving without apology, soldiers training without limits, a state preparing without permission. This is sovereignty in real time, and it's terrifying to those who benefited from African weakness. The image of Malian soldiers training with wooden rifles will never be forgotten. It's burned into national memory, a scar, a reminder of what dependency costs. But that chapter is closed. Today, Mali trains with real weapons, bought with Malian gold, delivered to Malian soldiers, controlled by a Malian government that answers to Malian people. This isn't just about military hardware, it's about dignity, control, choice. Mali has gone from symbolic defense to strategic readiness, from wooden guns to steel resolve. President Assimi Goïta isn't preparing for applause, he's preparing for pressure. The Black Winter is approaching, terrorism is adapting, foreign interests are recalibrating, destabilization is intensifying. But this time, Mali is armed. This time, Mali is ready. And this time, the Sahel will not collapse quietly. They gave them wooden rifles and told them to fight terrorism. Now Mali is buying tanks with gold and telling the world to watch, because sovereignty isn't granted. It's armed. This investigation was made possible by our members. No ads, no sponsors with agendas, just truth. If you want more stories like this, stories the mainstream won't touch, join the membership below. You don't just support, you help decide what we cover next. This is Pan-African Media, independent, unapologetic, unstoppable. See you in the next one.
Washington is issuing threats. American troops are on the move. The IRGC is in full alert mode. Tehran is loading missiles. The targets are locked and loaded. The Arab nations, Russia, and even Israel are urging President Trump to hold off the attack. This is no bluff because Iran is no soft target.
The United States has warned of possible military action. President Donald Trump has been briefed on strike options and potential targets deep inside Iran. Tehran has placed its armed forces on high alert and issued a blunt warning. Any attack will trigger retaliation not just against the United States, but also against neighbors hosting American bases. Arab nations are urging restraint. They fear the fallout. Because this war, if it comes, will not be short. It will not be contained and it will not be simple. The situation could quickly spiral into a firestorm. Iran says it is ready to fight. The real question is whether it can endure a prolonged war with the world's most powerful military. Across air, land, sea, cyberspace, and multiple regional fronts. Militarily, Iran is not defenseless, far from it. Iran fields around 580,000 active duty troops and another 200,000 in reserve, one of the largest forces in West Asia. Its military is split between the regular army and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC, an elite force tasked with regime survival, internal control, and regional operations. Iran's real strength lies in missiles and drones. Tehran possesses one of the largest missile arsenals in the region. Ballistic missiles with ranges up to 2,000 kilometers, cruise missiles, precision-guided systems, underground launch sites buried deep in mountains. US bases across West Asia from Iraq to the Gulf are within striking distance. US has about 50,000 soldiers deployed across the region. Israel is within range. Iran also boasts of hypersonic missiles, which are extremely difficult to stop. Israel witnessed the fury firsthand in June last year. The famed Iron Dome failed to intercept many projectiles, and this is the destruction, and Israel knows it. The Israeli attack was relentless. Iranian military sites, weapon depots, and even nuclear facilities were badly damaged. But Iran has rebuilt fast. After the 12-day war last year, when US and Israeli strikes hit nuclear sites and wiped out senior commanders, including IRGC chief Hossein Salami. Tehran moved quickly. Production lines were restored, missile stockpiles replenished. The Revolutionary Guards now openly claim increased missile reserves and heightened battle readiness. Then there are the drones. The Shahed series, cheap, deadly, battle-tested in Ukraine and Sudan. They are hard to intercept, ideal for overwhelming air defenses. Iran has thousands of them. Add to this the proxy network, battle-hardened Hezbollah, Hamas remnants, the Houthis who have long-range missiles. Then there are militias across Iraq and Syria, controlled, armed, and coordinated by the IRGC. Though each of them have been hit, they have been hit very hard by Israel and the United States. Today, they all are a depleted force, but still hold a lot of firepower. Any war risks igniting all fronts at once. But Iran's strength has limits. Iran's military has taken blows. Its proxy shield has been badly damaged. Its top leadership has been targeted, and its economy is dangerously weak. Iran's military has taken a blow. The Iranian rial has collapsed to nearly 1.47 million to the US dollar. Inflation jumped to about 47%. The falling currency has wiped out savings, reduced purchasing power, and created fear that prices will continue rising.
Well, the situation in the bazaar has slightly improved. People come to shop a bit more, but generally the whole cost of living situation for people is weak, especially in shopping. But thankfully the security situation is improving. People come out to shop a bit more.
This economic collapse sparked the protests now rocking the country. A war would push it over the edge. Diplomatically, Iran has backing. But is that enough? Russia and China oppose US aggression. Turkey and Qatar. Saudis have announced that their territory can't be used by US to launch attacks. But Venezuela has shown how little statements can mean when bombs fall. That is why Tehran is signaling both defiance and dialogue. Iran says it does not seek war, but it is prepared for one. And if miscalculation sets in, regret may come too late. The question is not whether Iran can fight. The question is what price both sides are willing to pay.
Hello, friends. Today we discuss the massive U.S. fleet approaching Iran. Trump has announced a major deployment that changes absolutely everything here. We must see if this is just a threat or war. Join me as we uncover the secrets of these dangerous shifts. Recently, Trump posted something very strange and worrying on social media. He claimed many warships are moving on a path towards Iran. A huge aircraft carrier is also being sent to those waters. It seems the military situation in the Persian Gulf is worsening. He said a large force is deploying to that strategic region. Trump emphasized he doesn't want bad things to happen. Just wait. These words show America has a serious plan to change equations. Perhaps this is the biggest military formation we have seen recently. The former US president emphasized that Iran is under their microscope. They are monitoring and analyzing all of Tehran's moves right now. These words are part of a vast psychological war to scare. America always tries to create fear and panic before acting. But the story does not end with US threats and ships. Unofficial reports speak of hitting military cooperation between China, Russia, and Iran. These three powers are building a strong defensive bloc against the West. This new alliance could upset all of Washington's military plans. Rumors say Iran is installing advanced Chinese air defense systems now. There's talk of the powerful long-range HQ-9B system being used. These missiles can detect and destroy targets from very far away. China has shown it will not allow an easy attack. Iran is rapidly turning its sky into an iron defensive shield. Mixing Russian and Chinese technology has multiplied their defensive power greatly. This move increases Tehran's defensive range against potential air attacks significantly. Now, penetrating Iran's airspace is much harder for American fighters. Experts believe these Chinese systems integrate well with the Russian S-400. Imagine a network where powerful radars talk and exchange data together. This creates a layered defense structure that is hard to break. This is not just a weapon, but a deadly smart network. This new combination boosts Iran's resilience against modern air threats. Whether stealth fighters or cruise missiles, their job is very hard. The balance of power in the region's sky is changing fast. What the West thought was easy has now become a nightmare. Another shocking piece of news has reached analysts in the meantime. They say 16 giant Chinese cargo planes landed in Iran recently. No one knows exactly what secret cargo was inside these planes, but one can easily guess that heavy military equipment arrived. Maybe defense parts or advanced electronic warfare tools and radar gear. This shows that Beijing is serious and determined in supporting Iran. The bridge between Tehran and Beijing is stronger today than ever. America must know Iran will not be alone in this battle. Now let's see how the Russians reacted to this sensitive situation. Maria Zakharova officially announced Moscow is in constant contact with Iran. Russia says it won't cut ties with Iran for a moment. This diplomatic and intelligence support is vital for Iran right now. Russia apparently calls for reducing tensions and preventing war in the region. They warn all sides to avoid hasty and dangerous actions today. But behind this calm face, a deep strategic military alliance formed. Moscow knows well that Iran's security is tied to its own. Intelligence cooperation between Moscow and Tehran has reached the highest level. They are exchanging information about American movements with each other constantly. This means Iran is not blind and has Russia's sharp eyes. This level of cooperation is necessary for survival in modern wars. It seems Western pressure has brought these countries closer together now. They realized they need each other to counter the US Navy. This is a classic example of enemy of my enemy is friend. Their military coordination can stop many American plans in the region. In the meantime, the commander of Iran's Qatem al-Anbiya issued a scary warning. General Mousavi explicitly said any aggression will be met with fire. He showed no fear or hesitation in addressing the American forces. This harsh tone usually indicates full readiness for a military conflict. He warned that US bases in the region are legitimate targets. If Iran's soil is attacked, these bases will be destroyed immediately. This means countries like Jordan is in danger. They are unwittingly caught in the middle of a major fight. To prove the seriousness, Iranian media released a meaningful special video. In this video, exact coordinates of all US bases were shown. They introduced these locations as definitive targets for their attack drones. This visual threat is designed to create fear in American soldiers. Iranian commanders say America knows the cost of any calculation error. They believe the Pentagon understands total war would be devastating for them. Iran is counting on America's fear of heavy human casualties here. They bet Washington will not risk a major regional war today. Iran has promised its response to any attack will be immediate. The moment an attack happens, missiles will rain on US interests. This strategy is designed to make war costs unbearable for enemies. This is a deterrence doctrine based on the threat of destruction. They claim they will give her response more devastating than imagined. They say they have weapons that easily bypass American defense shields. Whether true or bluff, the risk of testing is high. No sane mind wants to test these threats on the battlefield. We are currently stuck in a very dangerous and sensitive deadlock. One side brings ships, the other strengthens its missile shield today. It is like two trains approaching each other on one track. The main question is, who will blink first in this game? If a war happens here, people all over the world lose. Oil prices will explode, and the world economy faces a crisis. We are standing at the edge of a cliff looking down. We must hope diplomacy works before cannons and missiles start roaring. Thank you, friends, for staying with me until the end today. We are monitoring
From Middle East Eye, Iran receives China's surface-to-air missile batteries after Israel's ceasefire deal. The Islamic Republic is trading oil for China's air defense missiles as it looks to rebuild capacities destroyed by Israel. During the BRICS summit, Sergei Lavrov said that Russia is ready to help Iran with its civilian nuclear program, which was heavily damaged in these bombings. Benjamin Netanyahu is having a really extended stay at the White House. And there's many who are saying, reports are coming out that one of the big reasons for this is that there's coordination and discussion about another attack on Iran. We know that's coming. So talk about the significance of these developments then, of Iran looking to China to bolster its defenses, and how you see the coming days here as the discussion that you've had about strategic sequencing, division of labor, seem to be bearing much fruit.
A lot of people make the mistake of looking at each one of these conflicts in isolation. This is all part of one single geopolitical objective the U.S. has. And again, it is about establishing, maintaining, expanding global primacy. Every single one of these conflicts is linked to the other. The United States is trying to overthrow the government of Iran. It's not about their nuclear program. It is about regime change. It's about regime change everywhere. They want regime change in Iran, in Russia, in China. And at a minimum, they want to contain these countries, but ultimately they want to subordinate them and control them, politically capture them. And so this was not going to ever end with the U.S. just carrying out strikes on Iran's nuclear program. What this was basically the beginning of direct warfare between the U.S. and Iran, and also between the U.S. proxy Israel and Iran. This perceived political limit of striking at Iran directly rather than through proxies or fighting proxy wars elsewhere in the region, that is over. Now it is direct warfare. And yes, this concept of strategic sequencing and division of labor is the manifestation of people in Washington on Wall Street realizing the limits to their power, the rising multipolar world, and the realities that they do not have unlimited military, economic, political, diplomatic power. And they have to conserve it and use it very, very carefully now. They cannot wage a three-front war like Carl was referring to this Palantir head talking about waging a three-front war. It literally is impossible. And it's impossible for all of these reasons we've been discussing. The missiles alone, not just air defense missiles, but offensive capabilities. The U.S. simply does not make enough missiles to wage any one of these wars, let alone all three of them at the same time. They make something like 550 to 600 Patriot missile interceptors every single year. Russia makes over 800 Iskander missiles a year. And you would need about 2, probably more interceptors, Patriot interceptors, to take down one Iskander. And that is happening every single day in Ukraine. And so they don't even have half of the missiles they need just for Ukraine, let alone for waging war against Iran in the Middle East, and certainly not waging a war against China in the Asia Pacific. And so, Danny, you're talking about what is going to happen in Iran. Everybody is reloading, everybody is preparing. There was a lot of talk about, Iran needs Su-35 or Chinese warplanes. That's unrealistic. There's a reason Iran picked air defense and ballistic missiles, because it was the most realistic option they could pick that would be effective against the military capabilities of the US and Israel. You're not going to get 25 or even 50 Chinese or Russian warplanes and fight and overcome 200, 300 US Israeli warplanes. And you have to remember, it's not just how many warplanes you have. Experience, training, infrastructure, intel, all of these things mount in the US and Israelis' favor in terms of air power. So Iran is focusing on their strengths. Their strengths are air defense and ballistic missiles. So it makes perfect sense if China is resupplying Iran with air defense systems. It makes perfect sense. That's what is working, and they need more of that. And if they get more of that, and they get help with their ballistic missiles, this is going to balance things better in their favor. I always warn people not to underestimate the US, its capacity to kill and destroy things. People underestimated them in terms of Syria and how overextended both Russia and Iran were in that regards. And Syria is now a proxy. And Carl said the US cannot invade Iran on the ground. Probably not. But they have HTS, who is now being delisted under the Trump administration. Literally, Al-Qaeda in Syria is being delisted. And why do you think that is? So that the US can openly arm and back them in a proxy war against either Iran directly or its allies in the region.
It appears from recent reports that Iran is really, as Brian said, looking to regroup and rearm, and China is its primary source. Now, China has not necessarily verified these reports. They just said that their foreign ministry spokesperson said they're willing to give military equipment to friendly countries. Iran is a friendly country. So your take, your analysis.
Yeah, I mean that's. I think that we can take that as a confirmation. And I agree with Brian. It actually makes perfect sense for Iran to get air defense system first, because what we saw in that 12-day war is that Iran's missiles were causing major havoc in Israel. This is for the first time Tel Aviv and Haifa was getting hit. For the first time, Israel no longer can push their aggression with impunity. However, Israeli air superiority meant that they were, Israeli F-35s were in air hunting down missile launchers on the western side of Iran. Now, this is obviously not ideal because Iran's capability to inflict hurt on Israel is, major reason why Israel end up suing for ceasefire. So Iran need to make sure their missile launchers are protected. That's where Iran has advantage, because Iran has tens of thousands of missiles. But if they can't, deploy their missile launchers, because of the fear of Israeli aerial attack, that could be a problem. So in terms of air defense, people have to remember the international arms embargo on Iran was only lifted in October 2022, right? And so Iran didn't actually have much time to build up their air defense before the Israeli attack. Now, I know there's talks why Russia haven't delivered S-300 or S-400. But people need to realize right now Russia's priority is Ukraine. That's an existential issue for them. That's what Russia is concentrated on. Whereas China, according to the Western media, China have issue of overcapacity. Right, for China to supply those air defense systems, there's no supply bottleneck. As opposed to U.S. supplying missiles to missile interceptor to Israel, as Brian again pointed out, the United States deployed THAAD batteries to protect Israel. Now, those THAAD batteries, radar, launcher, everything together, each one cost $1 billion with a B, and each THAAD missiles cost between 12 to 13 million dollars, and pretty soon it adds up to real money. And the United States planned production for that missile interceptor was 12 for the year of 2025. So guess what? Israel has just fired off more than 1 year's supplies of that missiles. They fired off more than 1 year's supply of that missiles over Israel in course of 12 days. And there's no way United States will be able to keep up with that to supply Israel. And there's a real resource constraint because China's export control on rare earth minerals. For U.S. missiles, F-35, they require the Samarian cobalt heat-resistant magnets that come from China, and China has put on the export control on those both the rare earth itself and also the rare earth magnets since last year. This was a response to U.S. chip sanction against China, and this is why Trump was getting really huff and puff, and then finally in their trade talks at London, at first Geneva and then London, they resolved that China agreed to grant export license of rare earth and rare earth magnets to United States car makers, right? So which means for 6 months, which means right now, every companies who want rare earth from China, they have to fill out an application to the Chinese Commerce Ministry and say, please, sir, can I have some rare earth? And once the approval is, again, pending on their behavior. If China detects that they're directing that supply to, say, U.S. defense industries, guess what? That stuff can be stopped anytime. So, and also, for people concerned about that, there's a different, the military grade magnet is completely different from what goes into car production. The F-35 requires a lot more of those rare earth components than what goes into a regular car. And so this is the Chinese export control can be quite crippling to the U.S. military industrial complex. And plus, the U.S. just doesn't have the industrial capacity anymore to keep up with the battlefield depletion in both Ukraine and Israel. And this is why Israel sued for peace. But on the other hand, because the quote-unquote Chinese overcapacity, they have no problem. There's no supply bottleneck for China to supply air defense missiles to Iran. And that will clearly happen because, I was a bit skeptical, but when Chinese foreign ministry says we're ready to share our achievement with the friendly countries, I think that's a pretty much a confirmation. And this is actually pretty huge. China, Russia, Iran, they were already in the BRICS together. Iran is a full BRICS member, but now with the exchange, with the weapon sales, it's not just simply as exchanging hardware for money. It's actually building of relationships, because what that means now, Iranian operators will have to go to China for training. The Chinese will come to Iran to install and do maintenance, and this is a decade-long relationship building exercise. This is why United States, by the way, love weapon sales, and except U.S. use weapon sale as a leverage to tell countries what to do or what not to do. For example, when U.S. sold F-16s to Pakistan, they made Pakistan sign an end-user agreement that those F-16s cannot be used in a war against India, right? Whereas China weapon sale comes with no strings attached. China is not going to tell Iran, oh no, you cannot use this against Israel. No, like, it's yours. Go ahead, have fun. This brings the alignment of China, Iran, and also Russia much more closer together than even before. I think this is it's a move in the positive direction, and I am pretty sure that's something that also put United States and Israel on notice. Iran is not alone.
Yeah, and KJ, the timing of these reports are not a coincidence. Iran just experienced a major war of aggression, and now Iran is seeking help to ensure that any future, what will be a war of attrition, Brian laid it out quite clearly. This is not going to be. There's going to be no quick, massive scale wars. The U.S. just can't fight it, but they're going to try to grind Iran down, and it seems Iran is more than willing to get help from anybody it can, especially China and Russia, to ensure its survival.
This is going to go into attritional warfare, but the thing to remember is, I think, very important lesson from Russia is that the U.S. and the U.S. allies are not good at doing a war of attrition. They like quick blitzkrieg, decapitation strikes. This was the Israeli doctrine of war, and this comes out of, the Yom Kippur War, which later became the U.S. doctrine of war against the Soviet Union, air-land battle, and then now they have a doctrine of war against China, air-sea battle. All of this comes out of Israeli war doctrine from the Yom Kippur War, but primarily it's focused on rapid decapitation, deep strikes inland, very, very aggressive, violent, vicious tactics. And then if that doesn't happen, then we see the result, they try to engage in genocide. But there are a couple of things that I think are important to highlight. First, the relationship between China and Iran has been building over the last several decades. But you have to look at the historical, scope. And if you look at that, you understand that Iran and China have had a long history of very good relations, going back to the Sasanian dynasty, in the 600s, 14 centuries ago, that the Sasanian dynasty took refuge with the Tang dynasty, when they were Islamicized. And if you look, for example, at, 14th century manuscripts like the Court of Kayumars, which, tells the history of Iran, it's an illuminated manuscript. If you look at the pictures, they are Chinese style, landscape paintings. It's very, very Chinese. So you can see that over millennia, there's been a very, very close relationship. And of course, in the current moment, China knows that, both Russia and Iran, and of course, China, they're all targets. And so they have to work together. Certainly, they're going to support one another. China has certainly the industrial strength and the supply chains. And I think the other thing which, is very striking is the US, and in particular, Donald Trump, doesn't seem to understand the concept of a supply chain. He's only worked in real estate. Real estate really doesn't have a supply chain. Land doesn't have a supply chain. And a building or real estate only has a few hundred, a few thousand pieces. But a single jet fighter has 350,000 components, and all of them, a large number of them, come from come from China or from other parts in Asia. So I think that in terms of war, the contradiction is that if the US were to wage war against China or against China's allies, then it would very rapidly discover that it is waging war against its own supply chain. And Carl mentioned rare earth elements. Of course, rare earth elements are critical for modern technology. Not the least of it are, magnets. If you heat a magnet, if you want to demagnetize a magnet, you heat it. But we know that rare earth elements, samarium and others, you can create magnets that will tolerate extreme high heat. And so these are critical in weapons components. And they're also critical simply because the entire ecosystem under which we function, which is, electronic, is derived from electromagnetic force, which involves magnets. Magnets are critical to modern technology. So there's a real misunderstanding of the supply chains, of vulnerabilities, of the complexities of war on this hybrid economic supply chain logistical level. And then here's the other piece, which is incredibly, I think, ironic, is that, for example, the United States criticized China for not supplying cotton for their artillery shells, for the gun cotton. But what everybody forgot was that it was the United States that had sanctioned China's Xinjiang cotton and said, you can't sell this anywhere. And having created a global shortage of cotton, then they said, shoot, we don't have cellulose for gun cotton for M50, 155 millimeter shells. And then they started to, complain that China was withholding gun cotton from them. So once again, this incredible stupidity, short-sightedness, contradictory misunderstanding of what real strategic competition looks like. I think these are the weaknesses of the United States, which doesn't mean that they aren't crazy enough to continue to accelerate to war.
Yeah, and Brian, that's been the point you've been making, that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Iran rearms and is able to once again engage in a war of attrition without being toppled in that moment, right? It doesn't matter if the situation isn't as favorable as the 12-day war showed, that the U.S., Israel, they could kill people, they could bomb nuclear sites, they couldn't topple the government. But you've said that this is going to keep on going regardless, and sometimes there is, I think, an assumption that there's some rationality here, that, okay, well, if it's not really going to work out, if this isn't in the interest of the United States, if it's not going to, if there aren't objectives that are going to be met, then they'll stop. But that's not the case, is it, Brian?
No, it's not, because the entire system the U.S. is based on is is one of corporate financier interests. They are propelled not by any specific purpose to serve society, but solely to acquire greater and greater profit, which is why the US industrial base looks the way it does. Everything was outsourced without any thought of national security or any purpose to actually serve the idea of you're making things for people to do things, not just to make money. So the outsourcing was perfect for maximizing profit, but it made little sense in basically all other ways, conceivable ways. And the problem that they have now is even as they try to expand production, their entire industrial base, and they even put out a report, the National Industrial Strategy, where they were talking about, we have all these private corporations making things, and if there's not a demand signal and there's not a compelling business case, they simply won't make these things in the quantities that we need to wage all of these wars. So you have a system that is inherently compelled to constantly pursue greater power and profit, but the system by design is incapable of manufacturing the weapons and all of the other capabilities required to actually do this. And this is something that happens to empires all throughout history. They overextend themselves, and they're so obsessed with pursuing profit and power, they don't actually invest in the things required to get it. China, on the other hand, and Russia, and actually many other countries around the world, people don't understand this. They are using a combination of tools like free markets, but also a purpose-driven society, purpose-driven industry. I remember President Xi Jinping, when he was talking about the real estate crisis in China, he said houses are meant to be lived in. They're meant to be lived in. They're not supposed to be vehicles for speculation. Try telling that to anybody in the United States. Good luck convincing them or getting any sort of policy regarding that. Now, no, the United States is not going to stop its pursuit of war with Iran, with Russia, with China. As I said before, there is this global conflict. It's a global kind of slow motion World War III war of attrition that is taking place. You can see the limits, some of the limits the US has. You can see some of the limits Russia and China actually have. I'll give an example. People could understand, and Carl mentioned S-300, S-400 systems can't be sent to Iran in huge numbers because Russia is waging war basically against all of NATO in Ukraine. So it's not possible. China also has limits. They have a very compelling deal they can make with all of these nations, partnerships they can make with all these nations. The US literally has no alternative for. So China comes to Thailand, where I'm based, and they say, we can do all of these things for you. We can build high-speed rail. We could do all kinds of trade. We have tourists. We have more tourists coming from China to Thailand than all Western countries combined. But the problem is, even though the US cannot compete in this way, the US competes in other ways by coercing and politically capturing a targeted country. So the media space here in Thailand is heavily controlled and influenced by the US. And Thailand does not have the ability to push this out. They tried, say, like an NGO law to stop the NED from interfering, and the US just put more and more pressure on the Thai government until they were forced to abandon it. Things like that prevent nations from fully pivoting towards China. So they're constantly playing this balancing act where they're trying to keep the US from burning their country down, but they also obviously, the only real sustainable relationship they can have is with a nation like China within multipolarism. So this is the large-scale geopolitical landscape all of this is taking place in. It's not just these wars. It is US interference all around the globe. It is coercion and political capture. All of these nations are trying to balance. And even though China makes the most compelling, opportunities, let's just say opportunities, a nation is looking at that, but then they're also looking at the US will kill us. They will kill me. They will sanction me. They will destabilize my society. So even though the US has nothing to offer and much less energy is being put into destabilizing the country, it's a more compelling form of coercion than say, Chinese economic persuasion, positive persuasion versus negative coercion.
Yeah, and this is why for Iran, you know, a lot of people criticize Iran. They say Iran didn't do this, they didn't do that, they're too weak, they're not going strong enough. I think people don't appreciate a lot of times in the collective West that self-determination and sovereignty are just such critical components to just being able to exist and develop independently. And Iran, regardless of whoever's been leader in Iran for the last since 1979, they've been able to achieve that, and that's why they are still standing after what was a significant war of aggression, and that's why they're rearming and regrouping. Now they know it's inevitable, and regardless of whatever minutia of what decisions they make that some people may see as a mistake or not good enough or what have you, the fact of the matter is that Iran would not be standing right now without sovereignty, with the maximum pressure sanctions. If it didn't have China as a partner, if it wasn't willing to do, Brian, what you say many countries are just not able to do. They're not able to be in the Belt and Road, or even if they are in the Belt and Road, they're not able to finish projects. That's one of the biggest issues in the Belt and Road Initiative is these governments are not prepared to equally invest, and some projects just aren't going to get done. So that's a big issue, but Iran appears to be moving forward, and we're going to have to keep track of the next phase, the next chapter, as Netanyahu gets his room in Washington, D.C. and stays there for however long to coordinate and collaborate around.
Trump moves his aircraft carriers toward Iran, declares, "We will force Tehran to kneel." Diego Garcia's air bases fill with U.S. warplanes. Squadrons reroute their flight paths. Bombs are armed. Operations rooms buzz with the mindset of a sudden first strike. It's as if war is just a matter of timing, but there is a problem. Washington wasn't alone on the stage. Just as Trump thought Iran was trapped by sea, China entered the scene. No fanfare, no noise, and quietly sent its latest air defenses shield to Tehran, the long-range HQ-9B. The real danger, Iran didn't treat it as just another weapon, it treated it as a piece that would turn its sky into a network of traps, waiting for American aircraft to approach, then turning the surgical strike into sudden funerals. A storm of hidden truths lies behind the Chinese shield now entrenched in Iran, and we're about to uncover them. Stay with us. After China stepped in, Iran no longer relied solely on its domestic arsenal. It added to its layered defense network the Chinese-made HQ-9B, recently delivered. But this isn't a standalone system. It's a fully integrated architecture built on the logic of networked warfare. It begins with early warning radar arrays that detect targets at long distances, then passes the tracking data to fire control radars that lock onto the target. Behind the lines, a command center assigns the engagements, deciding who fires, when, and at what. And in the forward layer, long-range missiles are ready to see the skies before intruders even enter the battlefield. But the real threat doesn't lie in the system itself. It lies in how the HQ-9B rewrites the rules of engagement, especially against the typical American strike doctrine. U.S. air operations depend on three pillars: silent approach, detection, and firing from a safe distance. The HQ-9B was engineered to destroy the model entirely. The moment an aircraft enters its threat zone, it's tracked by early warning systems. It's forced to shift altitude or route to avoid radar locks, and from that moment, the psychological battle begins. A constant threat looms overhead. Command decisions grow tense. Support planes like AWACS and area refuelers lose freedom of maneuver. But even worse, the HQ-9B doesn't operate alone. For years, Iran has been building its own multi-layered defense umbrella. Long-range platforms like the S-300 and Bavar 373, mid-range systems like Khordad and Tor, and short-range defenses to cover blind spots. The HQ-9B adds another outer ring, a layer that doesn't just react, it watches, intercepts, and disrupts the battle before it even begins. That's why US pilots no longer just fear the missiles, they fear the entire change of scene imposed by this system. Every approach is now expensive, every miscalculation could be fatal, and pilots forced to evade under such pressure may lose targeting discipline or worse, abort the mission entirely. And at the moment of a real strike, it's not that the US can't hit Iran, it's that the strike now requires more time, tighter coordination, and far greater risk. Meanwhile, Iran only needs one thing: to shoot down a single American or Israeli aircraft, just one, because that would transform the entire confrontation from a calculated raid to an international political and media crisis. This is what makes the Chinese shield in Iran so potent, not because it guarantees to stop every strike, but because it raises the price of aggression so high that Washington might hesitate before pulling the trigger. A deeper look at the Chinese HQ-9B shield. Iran did not acquire an ordinary air defense system. It received a combat ceiling designed and signed by China. The HQ-9B is engineered to eliminate aircraft before they even get close and to continue functioning even after some elements of its defense network are knocked out. At its heart lies the HT-233 engagement radar, an electronically scanned AESA array capable of full 360 degrees coverage without any mechanical movement, which means instant response and high precision tracking. Its detection range exceeds 300 kilometers, with the ability to track up to 100 targets simultaneously and engage 6 of them at once. But this radar isn't limited to high-altitude threats. It can detect low-flying targets from 30 meters up to 120 kilometers, meaning it covers drones, cruise missiles, and stealthy low-level penetrators alike. All of this is managed through a central command and control system powered by artificial intelligence, capable of prioritizing targets and engagements in real time. It also supports IFF protocols to identify friend from foe and includes both electronic jamming and counter-jamming features. The HQ-9B fires missiles that are cloned from Russia's S-400, each measuring 6.8 meters in length with a 180-kilogram high-explosive fragmentation warhead. These solid-fuel dual-stage missiles reach speeds of Mach 4.2, which is over 5,000 kilometers per hour. They don't need direct hits to be lethal. They explode in proximity, showering the sky with burning shrapnel that can tear through aircraft and drones alike. The system is mounted on 8x8 mobile TL trucks, even each vehicle reaching speeds up to 65 km per hour, measuring 13 meters in length, with launch tubes rising 7.8 meters high. Each launcher carries 6 ready-to-fire missiles inside sealed canisters. The HQ-9B uses cold cold launch technology, where the missile is first ejected using compressed gas, then ignites after leaving the container, reducing thermal signatures and preserving the launch platform. Critically, HTL operates independently but remains connected via satellite data links up to 500 kilometers from the command center, allowing flexible dispersal without losing coordination or readiness. One launcher can be hidden behind terrain, deployed far from radar sites, yet still fire on command and remain fully integrated within the broader BattleNet. Even if one or two launchers are taken out, the system doesn't fall apart. It regroups, relocates, and keeps firing. What worries the Pentagon most is that the HQ-9B is not a purely Chinese design, it's a hybrid combat system. China reverse-engineered elements from American systems, including engagement protocols, AI logic, and network defense coordination, then fused those with external hardware resembling Russia's S-400, especially in propulsion, guidance, and launcher design. The result? A hybrid shield. It sees like the Americans, strikes like the Russians, and it's now controlled from inside Iran. And now, the question is yours, dear viewer. Will this Chinese system really succeed in deterring Israeli and American warplanes, especially now that Iran has reportedly blinded US satellites? Let us know what you think in the comments.
Right. So, Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky went to Davos. He criticized Iran over the protests there, and Iran's foreign minister replied by calling him a confused clown. Not diplomatically, publicly, by name. And this matters not just because diplomacy went straight out of the window here, but because it ends a long-running convenience a lot of people have been relying on for a very long time. Which is the idea that Zelensky can speak as some kind of universal moral authority and everyone else just has to take it seriously. Iran didn't bother to argue with him. They didn't bother to rebut his claim. They didn't justify themselves either. They simply told him where he could stick what he had to say. And another reason this matters so much is that a whole set of assumptions just stopped working all at once. Because the Davos platform stopped protecting the speaker. The values language stopped forcing compliance, and the habit of treating wartime legitimacy as a license to lecture other countries doesn't stand up, especially given Ukraine's own history on such things. Because when a system loses persuasion, it doesn't get debate in return, it gets ridiculed, and deservedly. Right, so Volodymyr Zelensky, he stands up on the Davos stage. He does what he's learned to do very well by this point. He speaks in the moral register. He talks about repression, talks about values, he talks about what the world should not tolerate. And this time he directs that language outwards towards Iran, towards the protests that were happening there, towards what he frames as a failure of the international community to act. And the speech landed to great adulation. Well, it would in Davos, wouldn't it? Easy to do when Iran was banned from attending as well, making you wonder if Zelensky would have been so bold if they had been in attendance, if he would have said such things to their faces, so to speak. But Iran is still not known to let such things slide, and within hours, the response to this came back, not as a diplomatic note, not as a formal rebuttal, not as a procedural complaint. Iran skipped all the typical diplomatic niceties completely and went with open ridicule instead. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi publicly called him a confused clown. Iran publicly insulted Zelensky because it doesn't accept him as someone who gets to lecture them. And why should they? Zelensky spoke as if his position in the Ukraine war gives him the right to criticize how Iran handles its own protests, especially given that Iranian authorities have publicly accused foreign intelligence services of exploiting protest unrest, framing it as something deliberately encouraged from outside rather than something that's politically neutral. And what Zelensky did works with governments that are funding him and arming him and politically invested in him as well. They tolerate the lecture because they're already on his side. And Iran isn't. Iran's a boogeyman. And their Russian ties are certainly well known, of course. So instead of answering him seriously, they chose to embarrass him. And the insult was in the message. Iran was saying, you don't get to talk to us like that, and we don't need to justify ourselves to you. And that's why it didn't bother arguing back. Arguing would have meant accepting him as some sort of an authority worth responding to. Once a country does that publicly, it's not a misunderstanding or a bad day. It's a decision to treat that leader as irrelevant outside their own camp, which he is. That's a change. Zelensky can still speak powerfully inside the Western bubble that adores him. But this shows that outside of that, the authority doesn't exist at all. Iran doesn't answer this argument. It doesn't engage with the premise. It doesn't even bother to deny the framing in detail. It simply refuses the speaker. The insult does all the work. By ridiculing Zelensky rather than rebutting it, Tehran signaled that it doesn't accept his standing as a moral adjudicator of Iranian internal politics. That move strips away the idea that this is a debate between equals about values. It turns it into a status collision instead. And Zelensky talked about protests in Iran as if they just happened because the government is bad, full stop. He spoke as if you can judge Iran's response without mentioning anything else, the pretext. And you can't, because Iran has been under heavy sanctions for decades. Those sanctions were imposed from outside with the explicit aim of maximum economic pressure, a policy that predictably narrowed living conditions and intensified internal strain, triggering a lot of these protests. That pressure didn't happen by accident. It was deliberately applied from outside to squeeze the country, squeeze a leadership that, for all the justifiable criticism you can aim at them, was simply targeted, broadly speaking, because they didn't align with Western interests. They cut the oil off. That's true regardless of what you make of the Ayatollahs and the clerical rule. If the oil still flowed west as it did under the Shah regime before them, we wouldn't be having this conversation, would we? When people protest in a country that's been deliberately economically squeezed, the protest isn't separate from that pressure. It's part of it. The hardship came first. Sanctions were meant to make life harder and destabilize the country. That's the intent of them. Protests then happen inside that pressure. So if you point only at the crackdown and refuse to mention the sanctions that helped create the unrest, and of course all those allegations that the likes of Mossad and the CIA were involved, of course, you're not being neutral at all. You're choosing to talk about the response while pretending the triggers didn't exist. That doesn't excuse repression. Of course it doesn't. But it doesn't mean the picture being presented is incomplete on purpose. Iran's leaders have been through this before. In 1953, their government was, of course, overthrown with foreign help, the last time Iran was a functioning democracy. And since then, pressure from the West has never really stopped. Sanctions, covert interference, open talk of regime change have been part of the relationship for decades. And because of that history, Iran doesn't see protests as something that float above the geopolitics here. It sees them as moments that foreign powers might try to exploit. And Iranian officials say that experience shapes how they interpret unrest now, whether we on the outside might agree with that assessment or not. That suspicion can lead to heavy-handedness and sometimes brutal responses. We've seen them. We know they happen. But it didn't come out of nowhere. It's based on experience. Zelensky's comments ignore that history and spoke as if Iran should as well. And the problem for Zelensky is that Ukraine has been through a very similar situation itself, which he's also skipping over. Since 2014, Ukrainian politics hasn't just been about internal reform or public anger. It's been tied up with foreign support, foreign leanings, Western money, security guarantees, all the geopolitical alignment around NATO and the like. The protests were real. Corruption was real. People were genuinely angry there too. But outside powers were also involved and invested in the outcome. That, again, didn't make those protests fake or illegitimate, but it did mean they were never separate from international interests either. Zelensky knows that because he came up inside that same system. He didn't break it, he joined it. Even before Russia invaded, Ukraine was already using national security arguments to control political risk. Certain TV channels were shut down. Political figures were pushed out of public life. Emergency power started to bleed into normal politics. And after the invasion, that just tightened even further. Opposition parties were suspended. Media was folded into a single wartime framework. Dissent was restricted in the name of survival. Some of those measures were arguably unavoidable, but none of them are hidden. And they matter when Zelensky talks as if protest and repression elsewhere can be judged without context back home. So when Zelensky speaks about protest repression elsewhere without acknowledging that states under existential pressure routinely securitize dissent, he's not speaking from moral neutrality here. He's speaking from inside an exception that's been extended to him because of the war with Russia. That exception has limits, though. And Iran's response marked one of them. There's a hierarchy of operation here that is usually left unspoken. Iran can be excluded from elite forums like Davos and the World Economic Forum quickly and cleanly without prolonged dispute. Ukraine, by contrast, gets embraced and platformed and granted latitude even where contradictions are visible. Israel occupies a whole other tier of this altogether, shielded regardless of whatever they do. It's not subtle, it's structural, and more people, I would say, can see it now. Zelensky's authority functions within this too. Iran's refusal is a refusal to pretend otherwise. So Iran didn't insult Zelensky because it lost its temper. It did it on purpose. It was intentional. By mocking him instead of arguing, Iran avoids treating him as someone whose judgment it needs to answer. If it had replied seriously, it would have accepted that Zelensky has the right to lecture it. Ridicule shuts it down. It's cheap, it's public, it sends a clear signal without escalating to anything else. At home, it says the government won't bow to Western moral pressure. Abroad, especially outside the West, it says you don't have to play along either. It's a message for the rest of the global South, so to speak. And to Zelensky, it says the way he talks in friendly rooms doesn't work everywhere else. Davos matters too, because it's not a neutral stage either. It's for the rich, by the rich. It's anything but neutral. It's a controlled environment where some countries are welcomed and others are shut out, depending on how acceptable they're deemed. Being invited signals approval. Being excluded is seen as punishment, but not everybody sees it that way. Iran was excluded last minute. Zelensky was given a microphone. And so when Zelensky used that platform to criticize Iran, the imbalance was obvious. The hypocrisy cuts through too. And Iran's response cut through the performance he gave. It treated the lecture as theatrics, as comedy, if you like, from the comedian, the former comedian. It wasn't authority, it was dismissed accordingly. None of that touches the question of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course. That remains a crime of aggression. Borders were crossed, cities were destroyed, civilians were displaced. Certainly NATO expansionism makes up part of that story too, but I'm not going to go into that here. Russia invaded Ukraine is still Russia's responsibility. Nothing about context changes that. But being a victim in one war does not give Zelensky a free pass to police how other countries handle their own internal problems. When he takes the language he uses to defend Ukraine and applies it to other states, he invites people to examine his own position much more closely than his wartime narrative can comfortably handle. Iran's response locks something into place here, that Zelensky can no longer assume his moral authority is accepted outside Western spaces. It isn't being quietly tolerated or politely sidestepped by everyone. It's being rejected openly by some, as Iran has shown. And that doesn't reset after one incident. From here on, when Zelensky speaks this way about other countries, it'll be heard less as a neutral appeal to principles and more as a political move by someone speaking from inside a Western power structure that protects him. For a long time, Western governments have said their rules are fair, that sanctions and exclusions are about principles and not politics. But that claim only works if people go along with it. When a country openly laughs at a moral lecture instead of complying, that falls apart. The power structure doesn't disappear. It stops looking as legitimate, though. An authority that depends on being respected stops working once it becomes something people feel free to mock, and Iran certainly do. Zelensky didn't build this setup. He's learnt how to operate inside it. He's used it well to defend Ukraine. But it's got limits, and Davos showed one of them. Iran didn't threaten war here. It didn't raise stakes. It simply refused to take him seriously and called him a clown. And being a former comedian, it hits Zelensky just a little bit harder, in my view, as well. Nothing has been solved by this exchange. No conflict has ended. What has changed is the ground rules people were relying on. Moral language now arrives attached to obvious power, not as something neutral. Selective punishment, selective outrage can now be called out and brushed aside instead of quietly tolerated. And the idea that being at war automatically gives someone global authority is a bust. Everything else keeps moving. The war goes on, the sanctions stay in place, Davos still meets. But one belief has gone, and that's the belief that if the right person says the right words in the right elite room, everyone else has to listen. They don't. Iran shut the door on backing out of this quietly. If it had replied with a normal diplomatic statement, as I'm sure every other Western leader would have nasally delivered, everyone could have moved on and pretended it was just another disagreement. But by choosing ridicule instead, Iran made that impossible. Once you publicly treat a foreign leader as unserious, you can't later reset the relationship without losing face. Better fit a few more. Tried that with Trump. But from this point on, any interaction happens under new conditions, whether either side likes it or not. So this isn't really about Zelensky as a person. It's about where his authority actually works. Inside the group of countries funding Ukraine and arming it, tying their own reputation to its survival, his moral language might have some weight. It might move some things, but outside that, the same language sounds like pressure coming from a Western-backed position, which it basically is. And Iran's response draws that line clearly and refuses to accept such pressure. And Iran wasn't mainly talking to Zelensky anyway. It was talking to people at home, to neighbors in the region, to the countries across the global south that have spent years being lectured or being sanctioned at the same time. The insults meant to show that Tehran won't play the part of the obedient target, even symbolically. It works precisely because it was blunt. Polite reply would have softened the message and left room for doubt. Zelensky's way of talking only works if people accept the idea that moral arguments stand on their own, separate from power. That idea has shaped Western foreign policy for years, but in reality, it's never been true. Moral language works best when it's backed by money and weapons and institutions and the ability to punish people who don't comply. When that kind of backing weakens, though, the language stops carrying any weight. Iran didn't bend to it. It snapped it by refusing to recognize it at all. And none of this makes Iran good or fair or necessarily justified. You can have your own views for and against Iran, whatever they might be. But it doesn't clean up repression or excuse abuse either. Yet what it does show is that the tool Zelensky is using only functions when the other side agrees to treat it as legitimate. Once that doesn't happen, the language stops sounding persuasive and starts sounding threatening instead. And at that point, it doesn't calm situations down, it provokes them. Now, there's an obvious contradiction here as well, and that's that Zelensky has spent the war arguing that Ukraine's own restrictions on media and politics and dissent shouldn't be judged as if the country were at peace. His allies have accepted that argument because Ukraine's under threat. But when he talks about Iran, he drops that logic totally. He judges Iran as if context doesn't matter anymore, as if the sanctions and the pressure and the past interference doesn't exist. Never happened, even though Iran is very much still under constant external threat as well. It's just in this case from the same people who happen to fund Zelensky. The double standard really shouldn't be that hard to miss, yet it's never drawn to, it seems. Ukraine asks for understanding because of its situation. Iran is denied the same consideration. Iran's response doesn't explain this contradiction in detail, but it doesn't need to. By mocking Zelensky instead of debating him, it used that symmetry against him without having to lay it all out. Because we've heard it, haven't we? We know about it. We should do by now. Davos and similar forums are used to hand out approval and take it away. If you're invited, you're treated as legitimate. But if you're excluded, you're treated as being punished. When that system is applied unevenly, it stops looking like a set of principles, it starts looking like a loyalty test. And in this case, Iran was shut out and Ukraine was put front and center. Seeing those two things happen at the same time ought to make the bias obvious without anyone needing to spell it out further. Zelensky's biggest strength has been speaking in clear moral terms without sounding over the top. And that's helped Ukraine keep public and political support when it really mattered. But that style doesn't travel well. When he used the same language outside of Ukraine and the Ukraine war, it starts to clash with realities his allies are willing to ignore, but others aren't. And Iran's response shows the price of that. The authority he relies on weakens the moment it's pushed into places where it doesn't fit, where it doesn't belong. Other countries are paying attention to this, I'm sure. They're going to be watching who gets listened to and who gets laughed at. And they're going to notice that moral appeals don't automatically work anymore, and that sometimes they get met with refusal instead. And every time that happens, it weakens the idea that you can just organize global politics by just talking about values, as if that word means something in and of itself. This isn't just about Iran gaining confidence. It changes how everyone else judges that language if it's safe to ignore. And it boxes Zelensky in, too. He can keep speaking the way he does. He can accept that outside friendly capitals, it will trigger pushback, though. He has to. Or he can pull back and think for a moment longer and stick to talking about Ukraine alone. But what he can't do anymore is act as if everyone automatically accepts his authority, because they don't. So this isn't about one insult. It's about the cost of pretending there's no power imbalance while clearly benefiting from one. Zelensky speaks from inside a system that backs him, platforms him, and protects him. Iran's response forces that into the open by refusing to play along. It doesn't tear the system down, but it does expose the lie that it runs on shared principles rather than power. And that puts a constraint on the audience too. People watching this can't easily unsee the gap between the language being used and the interest behind it. They're pushed to recognize that talk about values isn't neutral, that it carries political weight, that it lands very differently depending on who is speaking and who is being spoken to. Once people clock that, it doesn't neatly reset again. Zelensky is still leading a country under invasion. Iran is still a country that represses dissent. Both of those things remain true at the same time. What's changed is how easily one can be used to lecture the other without pushback. Iran didn't raise the stakes here. It didn't threaten anything. It simply refused to accept the lecture. And that refusal strips away a layer of protection that Western moral language has relied on for years. Everything keeps moving as before, but one assumption just dropped out of the picture. Once it's gone, nobody gets to ignore its absence the next time they speak up. And of course, it's not just Zelensky opening his mouth on things he shouldn't. Those who were backing that Iranian regime change have too. Not that they represent anything better, of course. History showed it to be far worse, as you kind of find out all about right here. Please do also hit like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hopefully catch you on the next one. Cheers, folks.
Ёб твою мать, блядь.
Tonight, not the past, not archived footage, not a historical flashback. Tonight, fire appears again across Ukraine, and this time not at the trenches, not in open fields, not in small towns rarely mentioned. The fire reaches the center of national life. When fire reaches the center, war stops being geopolitical debate. It becomes social reality. And from this point forward, we need to stop shouting and start thinking. This strike did not stand alone. It is part of a pattern that has been visible for months. Night attacks, layered attacks, operations not designed for instant victory. Drones come first, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds. They are not sent to be heroes. They are sent to be distractions. They force radars to stay active. They keep operators awake. They exhaust systems without pause. Then comes the second phase. Missiles, faster, more precise, harder to intercept. And when even one gets through, the result is immediate. Fire, smoke, localized destruction, human casualties. This is what war looks like today. Not total, but constant.
Ебать, блядь.
Many people ask why attacks like this never seem to stop. The answer is not limitless power. The answer is pressure management. Russia does not strike at maximum intensity every day. It applies enough force to keep the wound open. This is not a sprint. It is a marathon. And in a marathon, the key is not speed at the start, but endurance. This is what surface-level analysis often misses. Kamikaze drones are often dismissed, called cheap, called primitive. That simplicity is precisely their strength. Simple systems allow continuous production. They allow rapid replacement. They allow constant pressure. One drone does not decide a war, but 100 drones every night change the entire defense calculation. Russia understands this. It is not racing to build the most advanced weapons. It builds weapons that are sufficient and sustainable over time. In modern war, that often matters more. The illusion of no limit comes from two directions. From Russia, because strikes are released in accumulated waves. From Ukraine, because air defense depends on external supply with a pace that cannot be accelerated at will. This is not about courage. It is about industrial and logistical structure, and war ultimately is about structure. It is important to be honest. Ukraine's air defense has not collapsed. It has not disappeared. It has not failed. It is working. Without it, the destruction would be far greater. But it works according to priority logic, not empathy. It protects the core of the state, centers of power, command infrastructure, because if these fall, the state falls. This is not moral failure. It is universal military doctrine. The problem is the cost. Every morning, official numbers are released. How many drones were shot down? How many missiles were intercepted? And these reports are often technically accurate. But technical truth does not always equal human truth, because one drone that gets through is more real than 100 that fail. Fire on the ground always outweighs numbers on paper. Look at the pattern of casualties: civilians, workers, emergency responders, not political elites, not decision makers. This is not coincidence. It is the outcome of protection design. Elites occupy the safest zones. The public lives in what remains. The state survives. The people absorb the cost. This is not about intent. It is about power structure. Before this war expanded nationwide, eastern Ukraine had already lived with conflict. Since 2014, this region did not separate overnight. It was gradually distanced, its language debated, its identity questioned, its social grievances reduced to security threats. For many people there, the state stopped listening long before weapons spoke. This does not justify war, but it explains tension. And without understanding roots, war only repeats itself. Strikes deep into Ukraine are not just about physical targets. They are about perception. War must not feel distant, must not feel regional. It must feel national. When everyone feels pressure, the illusion of normal life disappears. This is not justice. It is escalation. Amid strategic analysis, humanity is often a footnote. States talk about territory, about lines, about future outcomes. Civilians talk about today, about tomorrow morning, about survival. War looks orderly on maps, but chaotic in real life. That is the tragedy. Every time peace is mentioned, elites speak of risks. Political risk, precedent risk, loss of control risk. Rarely do they speak about the risk of human loss. War continues not because people are ready, but because states are not ready to stop. The fire we see tonight is not a technical failure. not an accident. It is the result of a system operating exactly as designed. Russia applies disciplined pressure. Ukraine defends by priority. And between two states, humans remain the most vulnerable. At this point, we are not asked to choose propaganda. We are asked to think. Think about who always pays the price. Think about who is always protected. Think whether a war that continues endlessly still speaks for its people. If you believe discussions like this matter, if you value analysis beyond black and white narratives, support this channel by subscribing, liking, and commenting, not to spread hatred, but to create space for thought. And finally, an important disclaimer. This video does not aim to justify violence, does not support harm to any human being, and does not represent the interests of any state. It is a geopolitical and humanitarian analysis based on observable patterns, field realities, and modern war logic. Because before we talk about states, we must remember one thing. War is always paid for by humans, and humans always deserve to be considered first.
In Abu Dhabi at this moment. For the first time, they will be held in a trilateral format, Washington, Moscow and Kiev. At the same time, Zelensky sent the new head of his office, the terrorist Budanov, to these negotiations, who publicly promised to finish off the Crimean Bridge. We have military and intelligence services on our side, so we can imagine the situation at this meeting. According to the Reuters news agency, Moscow is considering the Anchorage formula agreed upon by Putin and Trump in August 2025. We are talking about our control over the entire Donbass and the freezing of the current front line in other areas. Our own correspondent Elizaveta Kramtsova is broadcasting from Abu Dhabi. We can say with almost 100% certainty that this event will take place on the Al Ras Al Akhdar Peninsula, which is the center of Abu Dhabi's political and business life. It is this hotel complex, which is located just 300 meters from the presidential palace, that is being called the likely venue for a trilateral meeting between Russia, Ukraine and the United States. Earlier, presidential aide Yuri Ushakov said that Igor Kostyukov, the deputy chief of the general staff, would lead our delegation. And here's what Dmitry Peskov said about the Russian representation at this event.
These are representatives of the Ministry of Defense. We will not name them yet. This is a security working group. These will be the first negotiations, as you already know. They received instructions from the head of state last night, and they only flew there in the morning. Therefore, as they arrive, they will already be determined on the exact time of the meeting.
Igor Kostyukov's name as the head of our delegation, deputy head of the Russian General Staff, was previously reported by presidential aide Yuri Ushakov, and it is clear that by the duty of fate this man is not a media man. But earlier this month, we could see footage from the Ministry of Defense of Igor Kostyukov handing over to the American military attaché the controller from a drone that was shot down over the residence of Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Novgorod region. Then the Russian side provided all the evidence of the attempted terrorist attack. It is unknown whether this topic will be raised today. Most likely, the key issue will be the territorial issue. Vladimir Zelensky hinted at this. It is also known who will represent Ukraine. who will lead the Ukrainian delegation here. This is Rustem Umerov, the current head of the National Security and Defense Council, who previously headed the military department of Ukraine. In addition, this delegation will include Kirill Budanov, head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, David Arakhamia, head of the Freedom of the People Party, as well as representatives of the Ukrainian General Staff and the main intelligence directorate. In general, I would like to note the role of the Middle East as a venue for such an event. From the very beginning of the special military operation, the monarchs of the Persian Gulf have taken a neutral position, a truly peacemaking position, trying to find common ground, participating in resolving humanitarian issues. Fourth, we remember that last year, Riyadh in Saudi Arabia became the venue for the first important meeting between Russia and the United States after the new administration took office. The United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and other Gulf states constantly emphasize their peacemaking position and participate in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine as intermediaries, including on sensitive issues such as the exchange of prisoners and the exchange of dead bodies. And now no one looks at the Middle East simply as a former raw material appendage of Western countries. These are independent players who are helping now, if not to solve the Ukrainian crisis completely, then at least they are trying to find some common ground. So, the Russian delegation flew to Abu Dhabi on Friday morning, having received instructions from the Russian president. Putin finished negotiations with Trump's emissaries in the early morning, too, and the meeting lasted 4 hours. There is another person in the American team, Josh. That's how Witkoff introduced him to the Russian president. We are talking about Trump's senior advisor, who is also the head of the White House Procurement Department. Well, that is, they discussed not only the Ukrainian conflict, although the war is obviously the main topic. The American conservative writes that the United States will humiliate Europe until it admits defeat in the Ukrainian war. Next is a direct quote. Why does the Trump administration consider it necessary to publicly chastise the Europeans as an unruly subordinate? Because the Europeans don't want to listen to Trump. Our president and his entourage have repeatedly and unequivocally stated that the conflict in Ukraine must end, and Europe must find a way to live in peace with Russia. But the countries of the European Union have returned to the usual tactics of sabotage. So, forcing to peace through public insults. An unexpected masterclass from Donald Trump, who literally flogged the EU. Donald Trump is literally drowning in applause. The Europeans jumped up and greeted him standing up. Trump himself does not hide his contempt and does not particularly choose his words.
So other presidents have spent, whether foolishly or not,
Trillions of dollars were spent on NATO. We didn't get anything in return, and we didn't ask for anything. It was like a one-way street.
Certain places in Europe are not even.
Some places in Europe are no longer recognizable. I'll tell you honestly. This is not in a positive way, but in a very, very negative way. Europe is moving in the wrong direction. They like me. They called me daddy last time. They really like this idea. And now they're criticizing me. They think I'm terrible.
That, which the Europeans wanted to turn into a platform for discussing Ukraine, is becoming an arena for a transatlantic brawl.
After the war, we gave Greenland to Denmark. How stupid we were. And now all I'm asking for is a piece of ice, cold and poorly positioned, which can nevertheless play a vital role in protecting the world and its security.
Trump declares that Canada is not a tenant without the United States at all. That is, he will have to annex not only Greenland.
Canada gets so much from us for free. They should be grateful. Canada exists only because of the United States. Remember this, Mark, the next time you make a statement.
The Canadian Prime Minister remained silent in response, and only when he returned home and realized the humiliation, he bleated indistinctly.
Canada does not exist because of the United States. Canada is thriving because we are Canadians.
Macron gets the main criticism. In Davos, he still wears sunglasses. He hid his bruise and tried to joke at first. And then he threatened the United States with a bazooka. Trump replied to him.
Yesterday, I saw Macron wearing these beautiful sunglasses. What the hell happened?
What the hell happened?
Macron himself, and this is an obvious démarche, left Davos just before Trump's speech. The owner of the White House did not find time for a bilateral meeting, and he also leaked his SMS. That is, Macron was insulted in the best of feelings and ran away from resentment. German Chancellor Merz also received a refusal to meet, despite an official request.
This new world of great powers is built on strength, might, and violence. And now it's not the most pleasant place.
There were no bilateral meetings with British Prime Minister Starmer, or even with the President of Finland, who publicly invited Trump to a sauna. The Europeans also draw the conclusion themselves. All this time they were vassals, but now they have turned into slaves.
We are in a very bad situation right now. We are dependent on the United States. We are faced with the issue of self-respect. Being a happy vassal is one thing, but being an unhappy slave is another. Therefore, if we bend now, we will lose our dignity. Dignity is perhaps the most valuable thing that democracy can give.
We now live in a world defined by brute force. Therefore, Europe must accelerate its leap towards independence. The world is changing faster than our understanding of it, so we cannot delay. NATO is in a hospice, according to a diagnosis from the Danish newspaper Berlingske. The Dutch edition of NRC spoke even more cheerfully. Trump urinates on the grave of NATO. On the tombstone, the date of its death is 2026. European brats are the new word of transatlantic diplomacy. This word, brat, is spoken on Trump's favorite Fox News channel, broadcasting what Trump thinks when he sees those chuckles and grins. The European Union is dying. This is the verdict of Trump's special envoy, Brunel. He calls Brussels a nightmarish place. Trying to keep up with the trend, Europe was scolded even by Zelensky, who seems to be striving to join the European Union. On the cover, The Economist is the President of the United States, bare-chested, riding a polar bear. This is an allusion to the meme of Putin riding a brown bear. That is, Trump wants to be like the Russian president. This is the Zugzwang for Europe. France has now officially committed an act of piracy in international waters. Macron announced the interception of a tanker with Russian oil in the western Mediterranean Sea. The ship, named Grinch, allegedly sailed from Murmansk under the flag of the Comoros Islands. The French carried out the operation to seize the ship with the support of Britain. London sent a speedboat to track the tanker's movement, and it helped intercept it in the Strait of Gibraltar. The Russian embassy in Paris said that the French authorities had not notified about the tanker's detention. The diplomats are currently investigating whether the citizens of our country, Russia, were on board in order to help them. The Financial Times writes that Europe is starting to take tougher measures against Russia's so-called shadow fleet. The British Times hopes that after the capture of the Grinch, the Starmer government will act more decisively, calling on other European countries to join the pirate actions. A confused clown from Kiev also voiced his voice. Zelensky thanked Macron for seizing our tanker. He offered to go further, steal and sell Russian oil. The Financial Times mocked Zelensky, calling his trip to Davos a failure. The meeting with Trump did not bring the expected results. Zelensky wanted to receive $800 billion from the United States for the so-called prosperity plan for Ukraine. Ukraine has a new plan. Now it's called prosperity. But nothing has worked out with this plan either. CNN examines Zelensky's inadequately harsh speech in this regard. The publication writes that the leader of the Kiev regime wanted to win over Trump and the U.S. Vice President Vance in this way, and at the same time push the sluggish European Union. European politicians are outraged. Italian Foreign Minister Tajani believes that Zelensky has not expressed respect to the European Union, although Brussels fully provides his regime with money and military assistance. The leader of the French Patriots Party, Florian Philippot, accuses Zelensky of interfering in the internal affairs of the continent. Hungarian Prime Minister Orban has the same claim. Zelensky publicly promised to give Orban a slap on the head. Well, that is, he broke loose. The response has already appeared. Ukraine will no longer be taken by the European Union for at least the next 100 years. The Russian army is expanding the buffer zone in the Kharkiv region. The Ministry of Defense announced the liberation of another settlement, Semenovka. During the week, Russian troops liberated only 5 settlements, including Novopavlovka and Privolnoy in the DPR, as well as Perluki and Pavlovka in the Zaporizhia region. To the north of Pokrovsk in the Dobropolsky direction, the center group of troops practically liberated the settlements of Ivanovka and Novaya Shikova. It is noteworthy that just a month ago, Kiev propaganda announced a counteroffensive by the Ukrainian army and the encirclement of Russian troops. The reality is completely different, and it is now impossible to argue with this. Instead of a mythical encirclement, the Russian army is methodically moving forward, while the Ukrainian army is retreating in all directions. The German edition of Berliner Zeitung, on the eve of the negotiations, tried to predict how it would end. For Ukraine, as this newspaper writes, there are only 2 options. One option is bad, the other option is even worse. Kiev is being pushed to the wall by internal problems and problems in the war, as well as the lack of support from the very Donald Trump. The reality for Ukraine looks bleak.
Dear friends,
Kofi, follow me.